That night, the rain poured down, threatening to engulf the entire city. Seraphina Vale stood alone in a church filled with murderers disguised as guests. She was about to marry Cassian Moretti, the most feared mafia boss on the east coast of America. This wasn't a wedding. This was a sentence. Her father had betrayed the Moretti family, causing the death of Cassian's younger brother. Now she had to pay the price with her life. But on her wedding night, when Cassian saw the scars all over her body, everything changed completely. Please follow the story to the end, and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. The cathedral smelled like wet stone and dying flowers. Rain battered the stained glass windows so hard the images trembled. Saints with shattered faces, martyrs bleeding in colors that ran together like open wounds. Every pew was filled, every seat occupied by men in black suits who carried the weight of concealed weapons beneath their tailored jackets. They smiled when they were supposed to smile. They clapped when the organist played, but their eyes never stopped scanning exits, counting heads, measuring threats. This was not a wedding. This was a transaction. Seraphina Vale stood at the far end of the aisle, in a gown she hadn't chosen, wearing diamonds she hadn't asked for, breathing air that tasted like someone else's money. The veil covered her face but couldn't cover the stillness behind her eyes, the kind of stillness that only comes from learning how to disappear inside your own body while the world does whatever it wants to you. She was 24 years old. She looked 40. Not in her face. Her face was beautiful. Sharp cheekbones, dark eyes that held light without reflecting it, lips pressed together like she was always biting back something she'd regret. But her posture carried decades of damage. The way she held her shoulders, slightly forward, slightly hunched, as though expecting a blow that hadn't landed yet. The way her fingers curled inward when anyone stepped too close. The way she breathed, shallow, rationed, like oxygen was something that could be taken away. At the altar, Cassian Moretti waited. He stood with his hands folded behind his back, his jaw tight enough to crack teeth, his dark hair slicked away from a face that looked like it had been carved by someone who understood violence as an art form. He was 31, broad-shouldered, 6'2", with the kind of stillness that made rooms fall silent. Not because people respected him, because they feared what happened when he moved. Cassian Moretti ran the most powerful crime syndicate on the eastern seaboard. His name appeared in federal wiretaps, whispered in courthouse hallways, scratched into prison walls by men who'd crossed him and lived just long enough to regret it. He owned judges. He buried cops. He controlled shipping routes that moved enough product through the port of Newark to fund a small country's military budget. And right now, watching this woman walk toward him with dead eyes and a borrowed dress, he felt absolutely nothing. Good. That was the point. The officiant spoke quickly, nervously, his voice cracking on syllables he'd rehearsed 100 times. The vows were standard. The rings were cold. When Cassian lifted the veil, he looked into Seraphina's face for exactly 2 seconds before pressing his lips against hers in a kiss that carried all the warmth of a closed casket. She didn't flinch. She didn't react. She kissed him back with the mechanical precision of someone who'd learned long ago that resistance only made things worse. The crowd applauded. Cassian's consigliere, Marco De Luca, leaned toward his boss as they walked back down the aisle. "That's it then," Marco murmured, adjusting his cufflinks. "Debt settled." "The debt isn't settled until I say it's settled," Cassian replied without looking at him. "Her father killed my brother. A ring on her finger doesn't erase that." "So what's the plan?" Cassian glanced sideways at his new wife, who walked 3 steps behind him like she'd been trained to do. "I'm going to take everything she has left, and I'm going to do it slowly enough that she feels every single piece of herself disappear." Marco studied him for a long moment, then looked away. He'd known Cassian since they were teenagers stealing cigarettes behind the loading docks in Red Hook. He'd watched Cassian evolve from a street-level enforcer into the coldest decision-maker in the organization. But something about tonight felt different. Something about the way Cassian said those words felt less like strategy and more like a man trying to convince himself. Marco kept that observation to himself. He'd survived this long by knowing when to shut up. The reception unfolded inside the estate's grand hall, a cavernous room with 40-foot ceilings, Italian marble floors, and chandeliers that cost more than most people's houses. Champagne moved through the crowd on silver trays carried by servers who'd been vetted, searched, and threatened into silence. A jazz quartet played standards that nobody listened to. Conversations hummed beneath the music, deals being finalized, alliances being tested, grudges being cataloged for later. Seraphina sat at the head table and touched nothing. Not the champagne, not the food, not the napkin folded into a swan beside her plate. She watched the room the way a prisoner watches a yard, noting positions, measuring distances, calculating how long it would take to reach the nearest door. 3 women approached her during the first hour. Wives of underbosses. They smiled with teeth that cost $10,000 each and delivered compliments that functioned as insults. "You look stunning, sweetheart. That dress almost makes you look like you belong here." Cassian is so generous. Most men in his position would have just, well, you know. "Your father must be so proud. Oh, wait. Nobody knows where he is, do they?" Seraphina absorbed each one without expression. When the 3rd woman finished her little performance and walked away laughing, Seraphina picked up her champagne glass, took a single sip, and set it down with a hand that didn't shake. But beneath the table, her left knee was trembling so hard she had to press her palm against it to stop. Nobody saw. Nobody was supposed to. By midnight, the estate had emptied. The musicians packed their instruments. The servers cleared the remnants of a celebration that had never actually been one. Rain continued hammering the windows with a fury that felt personal, like the sky itself was trying to get inside. Cassian stood in the master suite on the 3rd floor, loosening his tie in front of a window that overlooked the flooded garden below. The room was massive. King-sized bed with black silk sheets, a fireplace that hadn't been lit, bookshelves lined with first editions he'd never read. Everything in this room was designed to project power, control, dominion. He heard the door open behind him. Seraphina entered quietly, still wearing the gown. Her hair had been taken down at some point during the evening and now hung in loose dark waves around her shoulders. She stopped just inside the doorway and stood there, waiting, the way someone stands in front of a locked room they know they're about to be pushed into. Cassian watched her through the window's reflection. He didn't turn around. "You can have the bathroom first," he said flatly. "There are clothes in the closet, the door on the left." She didn't move for several seconds. Then she crossed the room without a word and disappeared into the bathroom. The lock clicked behind her. Cassian exhaled through his nose. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon from a crystal decanter on the desk and drank it standing up, staring at nothing. He thought about Nico, his brother, 23 years old, sharp-mouthed, reckless, the kind of kid who smiled too much for the world they lived in. Nico had been working a collection run the night Seraphina's father flipped, feeding information to a rival outfit that used it to ambush 6 Moretti soldiers in a warehouse off the Gowanus Canal. Nico wasn't supposed to be there. He'd gone as backup because he was trying to prove himself. He died on a concrete floor with 2 bullets in his chest and 1 in his throat, surrounded by fire, choking on his own blood while the building came down around him. They found what was left of him 3 days later. Cassian had identified the body himself. What was left of it? He remembered the smell more than anything, that specific cocktail of accelerant and burned flesh that lived in his sinuses for weeks afterward. He'd promised himself that night, standing in a coroner's basement that smelled like bleach and formaldehyde, that he would make the Vale family pay for every second of Nico's suffering. And now, 2 years later, here he was, married to the daughter, the last surviving Vale. This should feel like victory. It didn't. The bathroom door opened. Seraphina stepped out wearing a silk nightgown that had been laid out for her, ivory, floor-length, with thin straps that crossed at the back. She moved toward the bed with her eyes lowered, and as she passed the lamp on the nightstand, the light caught something that made Cassian's hand stop halfway to his mouth. He set the bourbon down. "Stop." She stopped immediately, reflexively. The kind of instant obedience that doesn't come from respect. It comes from conditioning. Cassian's jaw tightened. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stood behind her. "Turn around." She didn't. Her breathing changed, faster, shallower, each inhale catching like a snag in fabric. Her fingers curled at her sides. "I said turn around." She turned slowly, keeping her eyes on the floor, and when the lamplight fell across her exposed back and shoulders, Cassian Moretti, who had watched men die, who had ordered executions without losing sleep, who had built an empire on blood and silence, felt something crack inside his chest. Scars, dozens of them. They covered her back in a lattice of raised white tissue and angry pink ridges, some thin as thread, others thick as rope. Cigarette burns dotted her ribs in clusters, perfectly spaced, almost geometric, like someone had used her body as an ashtray with the precision of a craftsman. Knife wounds ran along her shoulder blades in parallel lines that suggested not random violence but deliberate repeated punishment. Her left side carried a pattern of scarring that looked like it had been made by heated metal, a brand maybe, or a tool designed specifically for pain. These were not old injuries. Some of them were still healing. Cassian stared. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He'd spent 2 years constructing a narrative. The Vales betrayed us. The Vales destroyed Nico. The last Vale must suffer. It was clean, simple. It gave his rage a target and his grief a purpose. But this didn't fit. This was something else entirely. Who did this to you? His voice came out lower than he intended. Rougher. Not a demand. Almost a plea. Seraphina's chin lifted slightly. For the first time all night, something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that lived in the space between terror and defiance. "Does it matter?" she said. Her voice was quieter than he expected. Hoarse, like she'd spent years either screaming or refusing to. "I'm asking you a question. And I'm telling you it doesn't change anything. You married me to punish me, so punish me. I've survived worse than you." The words hit him like a slap, not because they were cruel, because they were true. She stood there in a silk nightgown with a tortured body and dead calm eyes, and told him plainly, without trembling, that whatever he had planned, she'd already endured something he couldn't imagine. Cassian stepped back. His hands were shaking. He hadn't noticed until now. "Get in bed," he said roughly. "I'm sleeping in the study." He turned and walked toward the door without waiting for a response. His hand was on the handle when her voice stopped him. "Cassian." He paused but didn't turn around. "Your brother," she said carefully. "What happened to him was not my father's choice." Silence filled the room like smoke. "My father didn't betray your family. He was forced. And when he tried to stop it, they killed him for it. I know because I was there when they brought his body back in pieces." Cassian's grip on the door handle tightened until his knuckles turned white. His pulse hammered in his temples. Every instinct told him she was lying, manipulating, surviving, saying whatever she needed to say to gain an advantage. That's what people in their world did. That's what the Vales had done. But her voice didn't sound like manipulation. It sounded like someone who'd been carrying a truth so heavy it had crushed everything else out of her. He opened the door and walked out without a word. The study was cold. He didn't light the fireplace. He sat in a leather chair that smelled like old cigars and stared at the ceiling for 3 hours while rain hammered the windows and her words played on a loop inside his skull. "Your brother. What happened to him was not my father's choice." He pulled out his phone and called Marco. "I need everything you can find on Victor Draven," Cassian said. No greeting, no explanation. Silence on the other end. Then Marco's voice, careful, measured. "Draven? The arms dealer? What does he have to do with anything?" "That's what I'm trying to find out. Pull financial records, known associates, anything connected to the Vales going back 5 years. And Marco." "Yeah?" "Keep this between us. Nobody else hears that name until I say so." He hung up and sat in the dark. Outside, the storm showed no sign of stopping. Wind screamed through the estate's iron gates like something alive and furious, rattling the old windows in their frames. Somewhere in the house, a door slammed shut on its own. Cassian didn't sleep that night. He replayed every detail: the wedding, the reception, the mechanical way she'd kissed him, the precision of her silence, and those scars, layered, methodical, the work of someone who'd had unlimited time and complete control over another human being. That wasn't street violence. That wasn't a one-time event. That was captivity. By dawn, the rain had softened to a gray drizzle that hung over the estate like a veil. Cassian showered, dressed in a black shirt and slacks, and descended to the kitchen where his cook had already prepared breakfast. He ate standing up, 2 pieces of toast, black coffee, and was reviewing overnight security reports on his tablet when Seraphina appeared in the doorway. She wore clothes from the closet: dark jeans, a long-sleeved black shirt buttoned to the throat despite the warmth of the house. No makeup, hair pulled back tight, She looked like someone dressed for an interrogation she expected to lose. "Sit down," Cassian said without looking up. She sat across from him at the marble island. The cook placed a plate in front of her, eggs, fruit, toast. She stared at it like it might be poisoned. "Eat," Cassian said. "I'm not hungry." "I didn't ask if you were hungry. I said eat." Something shifted in her expression, a micro flash of anger. There and gone so fast most people would have missed it, but Cassian caught it. He catalogued it, filed it away alongside every other fragment he was collecting. She picked up a fork and ate 3 bites of eggs, put the fork down, folded her hands in her lap. Cassian set down his tablet and looked at her directly for the first time since the previous night. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. No deflection, no riddles, just the truth. You won't believe it. Try me." She met his eyes, held them. He noticed for the first time that her irises weren't fully brown. They had flecks of amber near the center that caught the gray morning light and held it. "Victor Draven controlled my father for 3 years before the incident with your family," she said, her voice flat, clinical, like a doctor reading a chart. "He used my mother first. Threats, then actual violence. When that stopped working, he used me. I was 18 the first time they took me. I was 21 when they finally let me out. And only because Draven decided I was more useful married to you than locked in his facility." Facility. That's what they called it. A rehabilitation center in upstate Connecticut. Private, secluded, the kind of place where rich people send their problems to disappear. Except I wasn't being rehabilitated. I was being broken. Her hands stayed folded in her lap. Her voice didn't waver, but a vein in her neck pulsed visibly, and her jaw muscles flexed with each sentence like she was physically chewing through the words. Cassian leaned back in his chair. "Why should I believe any of this?" "Because you already checked the name. You called someone last night. Marco, probably, and asked about Draven, which means something I said got under your skin enough to make you look." He stared at her. She stared back. Neither blinked. "Draven orchestrated everything," Seraphina continued. "The information leak that got your soldiers killed, the fire at the warehouse, your brother's death. My father was the instrument, but Draven was the hand. And when my father tried to come clean, tried to warn your family, Draven had him dismembered and delivered to 3 different locations in garbage bags." The kitchen went silent. Even the ambient hum of appliances seemed to recede. "I know because Draven made me watch the photographs," she said, one by one, as a lesson about what happens when people try to leave. Cassian's phone buzzed on the counter. He didn't touch it. "What does he want?" Cassian asked quietly. "War. Between you and every other family on the coast. He sells weapons, Cassian. Conflict is his business model. The more crime families destroy each other, the more hardware they buy, the more territory he claims when the smoke clears. You're not his enemy. You're his customer. You just don't know it yet." The phone buzzed again. This time Cassian glanced at the screen. Marco's name. A single text. "You need to see this. Not on the phone. In person. Now." Cassian pocketed the phone and stood. He looked down at Seraphina with an expression she couldn't read. Something between suspicion and something dangerously close to recognition. "Stay in the house," he said. "Don't answer the door. Don't use the phone. My men are outside. They'll make sure nobody gets in." "Are they keeping people out?" she asked. "Or keeping me in?" He didn't answer. He pulled on a black overcoat, checked the handgun holstered beneath his left arm, and walked out through the service entrance where an armored SUV idled in the drizzle. Marco was waiting in the back seat, his face the color of wet cement. "Talk," Cassian said as the vehicle pulled away from the estate. Marco handed him a tablet. On the screen was a series of financial documents, shell corporations, wire transfers, property records, all connecting to a web of entities that traced back to a single node, Draven Industrial Holdings, registered in Luxembourg, with satellite offices in London, Dubai, and Newark. "Draven's been active on the East Coast for at least 6 years, Marco said, scrolling through the documents. "Arms trafficking, private military contracts, and this is the part that matters. He's been financing both sides of every territorial conflict from Boston to Baltimore. Every war we've fought in the last 4 years, he sold the guns, both sides, every time." Cassian stared at the screen. His expression didn't change, but Marco had known him long enough to read the microshifts, the tightening at the corners of his eyes, the barely perceptible flare of his nostrils. "There's more," Marco continued. "The facility she mentioned, Whitmore Recovery Center in Litchfield County. On paper, it's a private mental health retreat for wealthy clients. In reality, it's been flagged 3 times by state inspectors for unexplained patient injuries, and twice by the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force. Both investigations were shut down. Guess who funded the PACs that got the right people elected to make that happen? Draven. Draven." Cassian closed his eyes. His hand rested on his knee, and Marco could see the tendons moving beneath the skin as his fist clenched and unclenched. "She's telling the truth," Cassian said. "Not a question." "Looks like it, which means your old man's intelligence was wrong. Giancarlo Vale didn't flip voluntarily. He was a puppet, and Draven was pulling the strings." "And Nico?" Marco hesitated. That hesitation told Cassian everything. "Nico's death was engineered," Marco said carefully. "Draven needed a trigger event, something big enough to launch a full-scale war between the Morettis and whatever was left of the Vale network. Nico was that trigger. Wrong place at the wrong time, except it wasn't wrong. It was arranged." The SUV drove through sheets of rain. Neither man spoke for several blocks. Then Cassian said something Marco had never heard him say in 15 years of working together. "I've been wrong." Marco looked at him. Cassian's face was turned toward the window, watching the city blur past in smears of gray and neon. "I married that woman to destroy her. I told myself she deserved it because of what her family did to mine. But her family didn't do anything. Draven did. He killed Nico. He killed her father. He tortured her for 3 years. And I—" Cassian's voice caught. He swallowed it down like glass. "I brought her into my house and treated her like an enemy when she was a victim the whole time." "Cass, don't." Cassian's tone went cold again. The vulnerability sealed over like water freezing. "I need to know everything, every asset Draven has, every safe house, every shipping route, every politician in his pocket. I want a complete map of his operation by end of week." "And the girl?" Cassian didn't answer immediately. The SUV turned onto the bridge, and Manhattan's skyline appeared through the rain like a row of gray teeth. "She's not a prisoner anymore," he said finally. "She's under my protection. And if Draven sent her here expecting me to break her, I'm going to make sure that's the last mistake he ever makes." Marco nodded slowly. He'd seen that look before. The last time Cassian wore that expression, 3 men ended up in the East River, and an entire drug operation in the Bronx ceased to exist overnight. This time, Marco suspected, the scale would be considerably larger. Back at the estate, Seraphina sat in the kitchen long after Cassian left. She hadn't moved from her chair. The eggs had gone cold. The coffee was untouched. Outside, guards patrolled the perimeter in the rain, their shadows passing across the windows at regular intervals. She pressed her palm against the inside of her left forearm, where the worst scar lived, a long surgical line that ran from wrist to elbow, given to her by a man named Kozlov, Draven's head of security, on the 247th day of her captivity. She knew the exact number because she'd counted every single one. 712 days total. She'd counted those too. The question Cassian had asked, "Why should I believe any of this?" was the right question. In their world, trust was a currency nobody could afford. Every word was a weapon. Every truth was wrapped in 3 layers of strategy. But Seraphina hadn't lied. Not because she was noble. Not because she was brave. Because after 712 days in a room with no windows and a man who punished her for breathing too loudly, she had made herself a single promise. If she ever got out, she would never hide behind a lie again. The lies hadn't protected her. The silence hadn't saved her. The compliance hadn't spared her a single scar. So she'd told Cassian the truth. All of it. And now she was sitting in a dead man's kitchen, because that's what her father was, dead, dismembered, scattered, waiting to find out if the most dangerous man she'd ever met would use that truth to help her or use it against her. She heard footsteps outside the kitchen door. Heavy. Male. One of the guards. The footsteps paused. Then a voice. Low. Unfamiliar. Speaking into a phone in a language she recognized immediately. Not Italian, not English. Russian. Seraphina's blood turned to ice. Draven's men spoke Russian. She stood slowly, silently, every muscle in her body switching from stillness to survival mode with a precision that had been beaten into her over 2 years of captivity. She moved to the kitchen service corridor, pressed herself against the wall, and listened. The voice spoke again, closer now, just outside the door. 3 words she caught through the wood. Confirmation, tonight, the wife. Seraphina's heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was perfectly, terrifyingly clear. Draven already had someone inside the estate, and whatever was coming, it was coming tonight. Seraphina didn't breathe. She pressed her spine flat against the cold plaster wall of the service corridor. Her bare feet silent on the tile, her fingers splayed against the surface behind her like she could melt into it if she pushed hard enough. The kitchen was 12 feet away. The voice on the other side of the door was closer. Maybe 6 feet, maybe less, and still speaking in low-clipped Russian that she caught in fragments through the wood grain. Перемещение подтверждено. Жена сегодня ночью. Confirmation. The wife. Tonight. Her pulse slammed in her throat so hard she could taste copper. She knew that cadence. She knew the rhythm of those orders. Short bursts, no wasted syllables, the operational language of men who moved bodies for a living. She'd heard it through concrete walls for 712 days. She'd learned to decode it the way animals learn to decode the sound of a predator's footstep. Someone inside Cassian's security detail was working for Draven, and they were coming for her tonight. Seraphina's legs wanted to buckle. Her vision wanted to blur. Every trauma response she'd spent 3 years building walls against was clawing at the inside of her skull, screaming at her to freeze, to collapse, to curl into a ball on the floor and wait for it to be over. She didn't. She moved. She crossed the service corridor in 4 silent steps, found the back staircase that led to the second floor, and climbed it without making a sound. The carpet absorbed her footsteps. The house was massive, old, full of blind spots and dead zones where surveillance cameras didn't reach. She'd mapped every one of them during the wedding reception, not because she'd planned to escape, but because she couldn't stop herself. It was reflex, survival architecture. Draven had trained it into her with electricity and isolation until it became as automatic as blinking. She reached the second-floor study, the room where Cassian had spent the previous night, and closed the door behind her. The room smelled like old leather and bourbon. His coat was gone. His phone was gone. But on the desk, half hidden beneath a stack of financial documents, was a satellite phone with a Moretti crest embossed on the back. She picked it up. Her hands were trembling, but her mind was running calculations with mechanical precision. She couldn't call Cassian on his personal line. If one of his guards was compromised, his communications might be monitored. She couldn't call the police. In this world, police were either useless or owned. She couldn't run. The estate was surrounded by guards who might be loyal and might not be, and she had no car, no weapon, no shoes, and nowhere to go. So she did the only thing left. She memorized every number in the satellite phone's recent call log, 7 numbers total, including Marco's. And then she put the phone back exactly where she'd found it, adjusted the documents to their original position, and left the study. She went back to the kitchen. She sat in the same chair. She picked up the cold fork and took a bite of the cold eggs. And she waited. Cassian returned to the estate at 4:17 in the afternoon. The drizzle had stopped, but the sky stayed the color of gunmetal, pressing down on the city like a lid. He came through the front entrance, flanked by Marco and 2 soldiers carrying black duffel bags that clinked with hardware. His face was unreadable. The default mask of a man who'd spent the last 6 hours processing information that had rearranged the architecture of his entire world. He found Seraphina in the library on the 2nd floor. She was sitting in a high-backed chair near the window, reading a book she wasn't reading, her eyes tracking the same line of text over and over without registering a word. "We need to talk," he said from the doorway. "Close the door first." He studied her for a moment. Something in her voice, tighter than this morning, wound one turn past careful, made him step inside and pull the door shut. "You have a problem," she said before he could speak. "One of your guards is working for Draven." Cassian's expression didn't change, but his weight shifted forward onto the balls of his feet. A fighter's reflex, the body preparing for contact before the mind decides whether to swing. "What did you hear?" "Russian. On a phone." Outside the kitchen this morning, 20 minutes after you left. 3 words I'm sure of. Confirmation, tonight, the wife. That's me, in case you were wondering. I know what the wife means. Then you know we have about 8 hours before whatever's planned goes active. Cassian crossed the room and stood at the window beside her, looking out at the grounds. 6 guards were visible from this angle, 4 on the perimeter, 2 at the main gate. He knew each of them by name. He'd vetted them personally. He'd trusted them with his life, his mother's life, the operational security of everything the Moretti family had built over 4 decades. Now one of them was a traitor. How many guards rotate through the estate? Seraphina asked. 14 on the day shift, 8 at night. How many speak Russian? Cassian turned to look at her. The question was precise, surgical, the kind of question an intelligence officer would ask. Not a victim, not a frightened bride hiding behind cold eggs in a silk nightgown. 3, he said. Yuri Petrov, Alexei Volkov, and a new hire, Dima Sorin, transferred from our Newark warehouse 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, right before the wedding was finalized. The implication landed between them like a dropped knife. Sorin was brought in by Tommaso, Cassian said, naming his head of estate security. Tommaso vouched for him personally. Then either Tommaso was fooled or Tommaso is compromised too. Cassian's jaw clenched hard enough that Seraphina could see the muscles cord beneath his skin. She recognized the look. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. The expression of a man recalculating every equation he thought he'd already solved. I'm not going to sit here and wait for them to come, Seraphina said. If you want me alive, and I'm starting to think you might, though I'm not entirely sure why, then I need you to listen to me. I'm listening. Draven doesn't do single-point operations. He never sends 1 man when he can send 5. If there's a mole in your guard detail, there's also a contingency team staged somewhere nearby, close enough to breach the estate within minutes of getting the signal. Draven likes warehouses, industrial parks, anywhere with loading docks and multiple exit routes. The shipping district south of here would be my guess. You sound like you've been planning operations for him. I sound like someone who spent 2 years memorizing every pattern of a man who tortured me for fun. I know how he thinks because he carved it into me, literally. Silence. The kind that hums. Cassian pulled out his phone and called Marco. Get to the estate. Bring Enzo and the Rossi brothers. Side entrance. Don't talk to any of the guards on the way in. He hung up and looked at Seraphina. Really looked at her. Not with suspicion, not with the performative coldness he'd maintained since the altar, but with something raw. She was sitting in a leather chair with her knees drawn slightly together, her back straight, her hands perfectly still on the armrests. Composed. Alert. Operating on a frequency most people never reach because most people never have to. You could have run this morning, he said, while I was gone. You could have stolen the satellite phone in my study and called someone. You could have tried to disappear. I considered it. Why didn't you? She met his eyes. That amber fleck caught the gray light again. Because Draven has people everywhere. Every city, every port, every airport. I could run, and he'd find me in 72 hours. I know because I tried once before. Day 406. I made it 3 miles from the facility before his team picked me up. The punishment lasted 11 days. She paused. Her voice didn't crack, but something behind it did. A hairline fracture in the architecture of her composure. 11 days without light, without food, without anyone speaking to me. Just a room and the sounds of my own breathing, and the knowledge that eventually the door would open and it would start again. Cassian's hand found the windowsill. He gripped it until the wood creaked. So no, she continued, I didn't run. Running doesn't work. The only thing that works is what you're already thinking about doing, taking Draven apart piece by piece until there's nothing left of him to be afraid of. And you want to help with that. I don't want to help. I need to help, because I'm the only person alive who knows the inside of his operation, his network structure, his financial architecture, the names of the men who guard his properties, and the schedules they keep. I memorized all of it, every piece. Because when you're locked in a building for 2 years with nothing to do but survive, you learn everything you can about the man holding the key. Marco arrived 40 minutes later with 3 men who moved through the estate's side entrance like shadows. Quiet, armed, eyes scanning every corner. They assembled in the basement, a reinforced room beneath the wine cellar that Cassian used for conversations he didn't want recorded. The room was concrete, poorly lit, and smelled like damp stone and gun oil. A single table sat in the center, surrounded by mismatched chairs. Marco spread documents across the surface. Satellite images, financial records, communication intercepts. Enzo Moretti, Cassian's cousin and chief enforcer, stood against the wall with his thick arms crossed and his face arranged in its permanent expression of skeptical hostility. Seraphina entered the room last. Every man except Cassian stiffened. Enzo spoke first. "Why is she here?" "Because she knows more about Draven than anyone at this table," Cassian said. "She's a Vale. She's my wife." "Since when does that mean anything?" "Since now. Sit down and shut up, Enzo." Enzo didn't sit. He stared at Seraphina with open distrust, the thick-necked, heavy-browed glare of a man who measured people by bloodline and found hers wanting. Seraphina stared back without blinking. She'd been stared at by worse. "Tell them," Cassian said to her. "Everything you told me, start with the facility." She did, methodically, precisely, without emotion or embellishment. She described the layout of Draven's Connecticut facility. 3 buildings, underground levels, a medical wing where sedation was used as punishment. She described his security protocols, rotating 6-man teams, biometric locks, communication blackouts during treatment periods that lasted weeks. She described his financial architecture, shell companies layered through Luxembourg, the Caymans, and the UAE, with legitimate front operations including a private equity firm, a shipping logistics company, and a chain of high-end rehabilitation centers. When she finished, the room was silent. Marco spoke first. "How do we verify any of this?" "The Whitmore Recovery Center in Litchfield County," Seraphina said. "You've already pulled records on it. I know because Cassian wouldn't be sitting here listening to me if Marco hadn't found something that corroborated what I said this morning." Marco glanced at Cassian. Cassian nodded once. "She's right," Marco said reluctantly. "The facility checks out. FBI flagged it twice. Both investigations buried. And the financial trail. The shell companies she's describing match what I pulled from the Panama database this afternoon. She's not making this up." Enzo grunted. "Or she's been fed exactly the right information to make us trust her. Classic Draven play. Send the weapon in gift wrapping." "If I were Draven's weapon," Seraphina said, turning to face Enzo directly, "you'd already be dead. I've been inside this estate for 20 hours. I've identified your camera blind spots, your shift change gaps, and the fact that your perimeter team doesn't sweep the East Garden wall because the motion sensors there have been broken for at least a week and nobody's fixed them. If I wanted to let someone in, I could have done it 6 times over." Enzo's face darkened. He took a step toward her. Cassian's voice cut the room like a blade. "Enzo, back up." Enzo stopped. His nostrils flared, but he stepped back. "The immediate problem," Seraphina continued, as if nothing had happened, "is the mole. I believe it's Dima Soren, transferred to estate security 6 weeks ago, speaks Russian, arrived through a channel that Draven likely compromised months before the wedding. If Soren is reporting to Draven, then Draven knows the estate layout, the guard rotations, and probably the location of this room." "This room is swept daily," Marco said. "Then sweep it again, right now, while I'm talking." Marco hesitated, then pulled a signal detector from his bag and began running it along the walls. The room went quiet except for the faint electronic whine of the device. 30 seconds later, it beeped. Marco's face went white. He crouched beneath the table and peeled a small black disc from the underside of the center support beam. A transmitter, professionally placed, the kind that cost $5,000 and could broadcast encrypted audio to a receiver within a 2-mile radius. Everyone in the room stared at the disc in Marco's palm. "How long has that been there?" Cassian asked. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "I don't know," Marco said. "This room was last swept 4 days ago. It was clean." "Soren had access to the basement 2 days ago," Enzo said, his hostility toward Seraphina suddenly redirected. "He was down here checking the wine inventory for the reception. I signed him in myself. The weight of that admission settled on the room like concrete. "So Draven has heard everything said in this room for the last 48 hours, Cassian said, "which means he knows I'm investigating him. He knows Marco pulled his financial records, and he knows I'm starting to believe my wife instead of the story I've been telling myself for 2 years. Which means whatever he had planned for tonight just accelerated," Seraphina said. Cassian stood. The chair scraped against concrete. He placed both hands on the table and leaned forward, his knuckles white, his shoulders rigid. The coiled energy of a man who'd just realized the ground beneath him had been hollow all along. "Marco, pull Soren off rotation. Don't arrest him. Don't tip him off. Put Enzo's men on the perimeter and rotate the existing guards to interior positions where they can be watched. I want eyes on Soren every second until I decide what to do with him. And if he tries to leave, then we'll know for certain, and he won't make it past the gate." "What about tonight?" Enzo asked. Cassian straightened. He looked around the room, at Marco, pale and furious at himself for missing the bug, at Enzo, cracking his knuckles with the anticipation of violence, at the Rossi brothers, silent professionals who hadn't spoken a word but had already checked the magazines on their weapons twice. Then he looked at Seraphina. She sat perfectly still, her hands flat on her thighs, her breathing controlled, but her eyes were alive in a way they hadn't been before. Bright, focused, burning with something that wasn't fear. It was purpose. "We don't wait for them to come to us," Cassian said. "Seraphina, you said Draven stages contingency teams in industrial areas, shipping districts, loading docks. South of here, within a 15-minute response window, he'd want proximity without visibility. Marco, pull surveillance on every warehouse and industrial property within a 10-mile radius that's changed hands or been leased in the last 6 months. That could be dozens of locations. Then start with the ones connected to any of Draven's shell companies, cross-reference with the list she gave us." Marco was already on his phone. Enzo was already heading for the door. The Rossi brothers followed without being told. Cassian and Seraphina were alone. He looked at her across the concrete room, the dead transmitter sitting on the table between them like a scorpion someone had flipped onto its back. "You knew about the bug," he said. Not a question. "I suspected. Draven always bugs the room where decisions are made. It's his signature. He doesn't need to be in the room if he can listen to it. You could have told me privately, before the meeting. If I told you privately, your men wouldn't have seen me prove it. They need to trust me, Cassian. Not because you ordered them to, because they watched me find something they missed." He stared at her. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow wash that made the shadows under her eyes look like bruises. Maybe they were bruises. He couldn't tell anymore what was damage and what was just exhaustion. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," he said. "Most people are. They just don't survive long enough for anyone to notice." He almost smiled. It was the closest his face had come to something human in 2 years, and it passed so quickly that if Seraphina hadn't been watching for it, she would have missed it entirely. "Come on," he said. "We need to move upstairs. If they're listening, I want them hearing exactly what I want them to hear." They climbed the staircase together. For the first time since the wedding, they walked side by side. Marco's surveillance sweep took 3 hours and produced results just after 10 p.m. A warehouse in the Port Morris Industrial District, south of the estate, exactly where Seraphina had predicted, had been leased 8 weeks ago through a company called Baltic Meridian Logistics. The company traced back through 2 layers of shell corporations to a holding group in Riga that shared a registered agent with one of Draven's known front operations. "Satellite shows vehicle movement starting 2 days ago," Marco reported, spreading thermal imaging printouts across Cassian's desk in the 3rd-floor study. "At least 6 vehicles, SUVs, cargo vans, and heat signatures consistent with 10 to 15 personnel. Weapons? Impossible to tell from thermals, but given Draven's profile, yeah, heavily armed." Cassian studied the images. His fingers traced the warehouse perimeter on the printout. Entry points, loading bays, elevation. His mind worked the geometry of an assault the way other men worked crossword puzzles. "They're waiting for Soren's signal," Seraphina said from the corner of the room. She'd been standing there for 20 minutes, arms crossed, watching. "Once Soren confirms the estate's defenses are in a specific configuration, probably during the 2 a.m. shift change, the team moves. Breach the perimeter, Neutralize exterior guards and enter through the east garden wall where the motion sensors are down. You said you could have let someone in 6 times over, Cassian said, glancing up from the printout. Were you exaggerating? I don't exaggerate. I survive. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, then turned back to Marco. Here's what we're going to do. We let Soren send his signal. Marco's head snapped up. What? We let him think everything's going according to plan. Normal shift change at 2 a.m., guards in their usual positions. East wall unrepaired. But instead of the normal overnight crew, I want Enzo's team hidden in the garden, the east wing, and the service corridors. Full loadout, suppressed weapons, night vision. You want to ambush Draven's team inside our own estate? I want to annihilate Draven's team inside our own estate, and I want one of them alive, preferably the one giving orders. Marco ran a hand over his face. He looked like a man aging in real time. Cass, if this goes wrong, if they come heavier than we expect, it won't go wrong. You don't know that. I know, Draven. Seraphina's voice cut through the room. Both men turned. She stepped forward into the light, and for the first time Cassian saw something in her posture that he recognized, not from victims, not from survivors, but from soldiers. The squared shoulders, the level chin, the eyes that had stopped looking for exits and started looking for targets. He'll send 12 men, she said. 3 fire teams of 4, standard Draven deployment for a residential breach. They'll enter in 2 waves, first team through the east wall, second through the service entrance, third held in reserve outside the main gate. They'll be equipped with suppressed submachine guns, body armor, and flash grenades. Their primary objective is extraction, me, and their secondary objective is elimination, you. And you know this because? Because I've seen him do it before. Twice. Both times the target thought they were safe inside their own house. Both times Draven's team was inside within 4 minutes. What happened to those targets? Seraphina's jaw tightened. They're dead. The room absorbed that like stone absorbing rain. But those targets didn't know he was coming, she said. We do, and that changes everything. Cassian looked at his wife, the woman he'd married to destroy, the woman whose scars he'd discovered 24 hours ago. The woman who was now standing in his study delivering tactical assessments with the calm precision of someone who'd walked through fire so many times it stopped burning. You're not staying in the house during the assault, he said. Absolutely not. I'm putting you in the safe room, 3rd basement level. Steel door, independent air supply, communications array. You'll be able to monitor everything from there. I'm not hiding in a box while other people fight my war. This isn't a discussion. You're right, it's not. Because if Draven's team gets past your men, and there's a chance they will, they'll cut through that safe room door in 20 minutes with the equipment they carry. And then I'll be exactly where Draven wants me, cornered, alone, and waiting. Cassian's fist hit the desk hard enough to rattle the lamp. The printouts jumped. Marco flinched. Seraphina didn't. I am not going to lose you to him, Cassian said, and the words came out before he could catch them. Raw, unfiltered, stripped of every layer of control he'd spent his entire life building. Not a strategic statement, not a tactical calculation. Something worse. Something true. The room went completely still. Seraphina looked at him. For one long, terrible moment, her composure cracked. Just a fracture, just a tremor in her lower lip that she caught and killed before it could become something larger. But he saw it, and she knew he saw it. Then let me fight beside you, she said quietly, because the only person who's ever going to end Victor Draven is someone who knows exactly what he's capable of. And that person is standing in front of you. Cassian breathed. In, out. The sound of a man stepping off a cliff he can't climb back up. Marco he said, without looking away from her. Get her a weapon, something she can handle, and body armor that fits. Marco opened his mouth to object, looked at Cassian's face, looked at Seraphina's face, closed his mouth. Yes, boss, he said, and left the room. At 11:47 p.m., Dima Soren made his move. He stepped away from his post at the East Wing checkpoint, walked to the garden wall where the broken motion sensors still sat dark and useless, and placed a call from a burner phone concealed in his boot. The call lasted 9 seconds. He didn't know that Enzo Moretti was watching him through a thermal scope from the 3rd-floor bathroom window. He didn't know that Marco had already cloned the burner phone's signal and was tracking its transmission to a receiver inside the Port Morris warehouse. And he didn't know that inside the estate, behind locked doors and loaded weapons, 23 men and 1 woman were waiting for exactly this moment. At 12:15 a.m., 3 black SUVs pulled out of the Port Morris warehouse and turned north toward the Moretti estate. Seraphina stood in the second-floor corridor wearing body armor 2 sizes too large, a 9mm pistol holstered at her hip, and an expression that Cassian would remember for the rest of his life. Not fear, not rage, not the blank dissociation of someone reliving their trauma. Readiness. The readiness of a woman who had spent 712 days being broken and was now, finally, about to break something back. Cassian checked his weapon, checked hers. Their eyes met in the dim hallway light. "Whatever happens tonight," he said, "you stay behind me." "Whatever happens tonight," she replied, "you don't die, because I'm not done needing you yet." It was the closest either of them had come to saying what was building between them. This volatile, impossible, blood-soaked thing that had no name and no right to exist. Outside, headlights appeared through the rain. 3 vehicles, moving fast. Lights killed at the property line. Cassian pressed his earpiece. "All positions hold. Nobody fires until I give the word." The estate went dark, and somewhere in the black, wet distance, the sound of car doors opening, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, carried across the grounds like the clicking of a detonator. The first team came over the east wall at 12:22 a.m. Cassian heard them before he saw them. The soft compression of boots on wet grass, the barely there scrape of a gloved hand gripping old stonework, the specific quality of silence that only exists when multiple men are trying very hard to make none. He pressed his back against the interior wall of the East Wing corridor, 2 floors up, and watched through the window as 4 shapes dropped into the garden below, with the fluid economy of men who'd done this many times before. Body armor, suppressed weapons, face masks, moving in a tight diamond formation toward the service entrance, right where Seraphina said they'd come. "First team in the garden," Enzo's voice crackled through the earpiece. 4 men, confirmed." "Hold," Cassian said. "Second team at the service entrance, Marco. 3 men. Wait. 4. 4 men." Seraphina stood 3 feet to Cassian's left, pressed against the same wall, her breathing so controlled it barely registered as sound. He could feel the heat coming off her in the cold corridor. Not warmth exactly, more like the specific radiation of a body running hot on adrenaline and something older, something that had been waiting years for exactly this. "Third team?" Cassian murmured into the earpiece. "Still outside, main gate. I count 3 vehicles, 2 men per vehicle holding position." A pause. "Cass, that's 14 men total. She called it exactly." Cassian glanced at Seraphina. She wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were fixed on the garden below, tracking the 4 shapes moving through the rain-soaked lawn with the focused intensity of someone performing a calculation that had no margin for error. "Take the first team," Cassian said into the earpiece. "Clean and quiet. No shots if possible. I want bodies, not noise." What happened in the garden took 11 seconds. Enzo's team materialized from the shadows at the edges of the lawn, from behind hedgerows, from the service alcoves, from beneath the cedar trees that lined the east wall. The ambush was textbook. 4 men dropped in 11 seconds, subdued with the kind of disciplined violence that leaves people breathing but immobile. No shots fired, no noise beyond the dull thud of bodies meeting wet grass. The service entrance team lasted 9 seconds. 2 teams down, Marco reported. All subjects alive. Soren? Soren's in the garden, Enzo said. I've got him. Don't touch him yet, Cassian said. I need him talking. He moved from the window, and Seraphina fell into step beside him. They descended the staircase together. Her on his left, slightly behind, one hand resting near the holstered 9mm. He didn't tell her to stay. She didn't ask for permission. The understanding between them had developed in the previous 18 hours with the wordless speed of 2 people who've discovered they think in the same survival language. The garden was cold and wet and smelled like cut grass and gun oil. Enzo had the 8 subdued men arranged in 2 rows, zip-tied, and face down on the lawn. His people stood over them with weapons leveled. The only sounds were rain dripping from the cedar branches and the ragged breathing of men who'd expected to be the ambush and ended up being the ambushed. Soren was at the end of the second row. Enzo had a boot on his back. Cassian crouched down and gripped Soren's hair, pulling his head back far enough to see his face. Soren was mid-30s, blunt-featured, with the kind of eyes that gave nothing away by default. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't begging. He was calculating. "Who else is inside?" Cassian asked. Soren said nothing. "The reserve team at the gate. When they don't get Soren's confirmation signal, they'll either breach or run. Which is it?" Soren's eyes cut sideways. Micro-movement, involuntary. "They'll breach," Seraphina said from behind Cassian. "Draven's standing orders for failed operations are scorched earth. If the extraction team goes silent, the reserve team doesn't abort. They escalate." Cassian released Soren's hair and stood. "Marco, take the reserve team. All 3 vehicles. Nobody gets away." "On it." "Enzo, get these men inside, basement level 2, and get me Soren alone in 5 minutes." Enzo moved. His team moved. The garden began clearing with practiced efficiency. Bodies lifted, carried, disappeared through the service entrance. Within 90 seconds, the lawn looked exactly as it had before. Just rain and shadows and the faint smell of something that wasn't quite violence, but was adjacent to it. Cassian was already walking back toward the estate when his phone rang. Not the personal line, not Marco's. The satellite phone. The one only 3 people had the number for. His mother, his personal attorney, and one other. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He answered. The voice on the other end was smooth, unhurried, accented with the faint overlay of Eastern European consonants that years of expensive education had polished but never fully erased. "Impressive," Victor Draven said. "I expected competence. I didn't expect this." Cassian's hand tightened on the phone. He kept walking. He didn't look at Seraphina, but he felt her step closer. "Where are you?" Cassian said. "Somewhere safe. Somewhere you haven't looked yet. I'll give you credit. The garden ambush was elegant, using your wife's tactical knowledge against my own people. That's almost poetic. A pause, the specific pause of someone who enjoys being heard. I did train her well. What do you want?" "To congratulate you, and to correct a misunderstanding. You think tonight was the operation, Cassian. It wasn't. Tonight was a test. To see how much she'd told you, to confirm she'd defected completely." Another pause. "She has, which means the real operation can begin." The line went dead. Cassian stood in the rain outside the estate's service entrance, the phone against his ear, listening to silence. Seraphina was watching him. Her face had gone the color of the sky. "It was a test," he said. "I heard. He wanted to know how much you'd told me, how much you knew. He burned 14 men to get that information." "That's what I was afraid of," she said, and her voice was so flat, so stripped of everything, that it took him a moment to understand what he was hearing. Not fear, guilt. "I should have known. He always sacrifices the expendable layer first, test the defenses, confirm the intelligence, then move on the real target." "Which is?" She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes went somewhere distant, the specific, unfocused look of someone running calculations against a backdrop of memories they'd rather not visit. "He said the real operation can begin," she said. "There's only one target Draven would escalate to after confirming I told you everything. One person whose loss would destroy your capacity to function and make any retaliation impossible to coordinate." Cassian's blood ran cold. "Your mother," Seraphina said. He was already dialing before she finished the sentence. Elena Moretti answered on the second ring. Her voice was warm, unhurried, the particular ease of a 70-year-old woman who'd survived a mobster husband, a family empire, and 4 decades of violence without losing the ability to sleep soundly. "Cassian, it's past midnight. Are your guards in place?" A brief silence. "Of course. Luca and 3 of his men. Why? What's happening?" "I need you to go to your safe room, right now. Take your phone. Don't open the door for anyone until I tell you personally. Not Luca, not Marco, not anyone. Do you understand?" "Cassian, you're frightening me." "Good. That means you'll move faster. Go, now." He heard her stand, heard the shuffle of slippered feet on hardwood, heard the muffled sound of her calling for her housekeeper. Then the line caught. A fraction of a second of digital stutter that shouldn't have been there on a clean connection. Mom, are you still there? I'm here. I'm walking to the... The line went dead. Not the clean cutoff of a dropped call. The hard, specific silence of a line that's been cut at the source. Cassian stared at the phone. Then he ran. He was inside the estate and at the SUV in under 30 seconds. Seraphina was right behind him. She got in without being asked, and he didn't tell her to stay. Marco appeared from the side entrance at a sprint, still pulling on his jacket. Elena's line just went dead, Cassian said as Marco threw himself into the passenger seat. Draven's team is already at her house. That's 40 minutes from here. 25 if I drive. He drove. The city blurred past in streaks of orange and wet black. Cassian ran every red light, cut through 3 highway on-ramps at speeds that made Marco grip the dashboard, and navigated the rain-slicked interstate with the focused brutality of a man whose entire emotional architecture had been reduced to a single point. Get there. Get there. Get there. In the back seat, Seraphina held the 9mm in both hands and watched the road. Talk to me, Cassian said without looking away from the windshield. Tell me what Draven does to leverage a hostage. He doesn't kill immediately. He needs the hostage functional, responsive, communicating, visibly suffering on camera. That's the currency. He'll have your mother alive when we arrive. The question is what he'll do to her while he waits for you to come to him. He'll hurt her, enough to break your judgment when you see it. He wants you furious and reactive, not tactical. He'll film it and send it to your phone while you're driving so you arrive at whatever location he chooses in exactly the emotional state he needs you in. Marco's phone buzzed. All 3 of them looked at it. Marco picked it up, watched whatever was on the screen, and turned it face down against his knee without a word. His jaw was so tight it looked like it might fracture. Marco, Cassian said. Marco turned the phone over and held it up. A video, 12 seconds long. Elena Moretti, seated in a chair in a room Cassian didn't recognize. Industrial, concrete, lit by a single hanging work light. Her hands were bound. Her face was pale, but intact. She wasn't crying. She was looking directly at the camera with the specific dignity of a woman who'd spent 40 years married to a man the world feared and had decided she wouldn't give his enemies the satisfaction. Draven stepped into frame at the 7-second mark. He wore a charcoal suit, no tie, his gray hair neatly combed. He looked like a banker. He always looked like a banker. He leaned down and said something into Elena's ear that the video's audio didn't capture. Then he looked at the camera and smiled. The video ended. Cassian's hands on the wheel were white-knuckle and motionless. Give me the location, Marco said quietly, already typing. If he sent the video, he wants you to come to him, which means he'll have sent coordinates too. A text arrived 14 seconds later. An address in the Meadowlands, an old freight processing facility that had been decommissioned 8 years ago. South of the highway, close to the water, surrounded by flat wetlands that provided clear sightlines and no concealment. He'd chosen it specifically. Open ground. No cover. Any assault team approaching would be visible for a quarter mile. He's chosen that ground so we can't come in force, Marco said, confirming what Cassian was already thinking. If we bring a full team, he sees us coming and kills her. So we come small, Cassian said. How small? Cassian said nothing. The silence in the car answered for him. Marco looked at him, then looked at Seraphina in the rear-view mirror. Cass, Marco said carefully, you cannot walk into a Draven location with just, he wants me alive. He needs me to see what he's done, to understand that he's untouchable, to spend the rest of my life knowing he can reach anyone I care about. He won't kill me when I walk in. He'll use me. And her? He wants her back. Another silence. Seraphina didn't dispute it. He won't hurt her on arrival either, she said from the back seat, her voice stripped down to its operational core. He'll use her mother as the demonstration piece. What he does to Elena is meant to show Cassian what he's capable of. I'm the prize. He won't damage the prize until he's made his point. You sound very certain about the thinking of a man who tortured you for 2 years, Marco said. I'm certain because I spent 2 years learning exactly how he thinks. The way you learn the rhythm of a lock you're trying to pick. You feel every tumbler until it opens. Marco turned back to the front. He was quiet for the rest of the drive. They reached the Meadowlands at 1:44 a.m. The The freight facility sat alone on a flat expanse of industrial wasteland, its corrugated metal walls rust-streaked and dark. A single loading bay light burned at the far end. Two black vehicles were parked outside the main entrance, flanking the door like sentinels. The windows were blacked out. Cassian stopped the SUV 400 meters out, beyond the range of the facility's exterior lights. "Count the guards," he said. Marco used a monocular. 2 outside the main entrance. Probably 2 more on the rear. Could be more inside. Draven will have between 4 and 8 personal security. Different from the breach teams, these are his inner ring. Better trained, better equipped, personally loyal. Seraphina leaned between the front seats, looking through the windshield. "He'll be inside with your mother and at least 2 of them in direct proximity. The others will be staged as layers." "Can we get to the rear without being seen?" "Flat ground, no cover. They'll have thermal or night vision on the perimeter." She paused. "There's one way in that he won't have accounted for." Both men turned. "He only expects you," she said to Cassian. "He doesn't expect me to come voluntarily. His entire contingency is built around the assumption that you'll either come alone under duress or come with a visible assault team that he can respond to. He hasn't planned for the scenario where I walk in through the front door of my own accord." "Absolutely not," Cassian said. "It's the only way in that doesn't get your mother killed in the first 60 seconds. "I said no." "Cassian." Her hand touched his arm. The first time she'd reached for him, and the contact was so deliberate and so brief that it almost didn't register. Almost. "He'll stand down his reaction protocols if he sees me. Not completely, but enough. Long enough for you to move." Cassian turned in his seat to face her. In the darkness of the SUV cab, with the wetlands spreading gray and featureless around them, her face was all shadow and amber. Those flecked eyes steady, that jaw set, that posture carrying the weight of a decision she'd already made before she'd finished speaking. "If you go in there, he won't let you out again," Cassian said. "He won't let me out either way. The moment I gave you everything I know about his operation, he marked me for permanent containment. There's no scenario where I walk away from this free and breathing unless Draven is dead." She held his gaze. "So let me do this." Cassian stared at her. Marco stared at the facility. The wind moved across the wetlands in long, empty waves. "How long do you need?" Cassian asked. 3 minutes from when I walk through the door. Get to the rear. There's a ventilation intake on the southeast corner, Shvat. I've seen this building type before. Draven uses them specifically because they're decommissioned and unwatched, and they all have the same structural layout. Ground level intake 3 feet wide. Enough to move through. "You've memorized the architectural layout of buildings Draven uses?" "I memorized everything. I told you, 712 days. Marco let out a long breath through his nose. The sound of a man accepting an outcome he doesn't like but can improve. Cassian reached under his seat and produced a second weapon. A compact Sig Sauer, already loaded. He checked the safety, held it out to Seraphina handle first. She took it without hesitation, chambered it without looking, tucked it against her lower back under the body armor. 3 minutes, Cassian said. Then I'm coming in regardless. 2.5, she replied. Give yourself a margin. She opened the door and got out into the cold and the rain. Cassian watched her cross the dark ground toward the facility's entrance, walking at a normal pace, not hurrying, making herself visible to whatever surveillance was watching. He watched the 2 guards at the door react, weapons coming up, and watched her stop at the right distance and do something he couldn't hear from 400 meters away. But whatever she said, the guards lowered their weapons, and Victor Draven's front door opened for her. Cassian counted to 10. Then he was out of the vehicle, moving low and fast across wet ground, Marco a shadow beside him, both of them converging on the southeast corner of the building with 2.5 minutes on a clock that felt like it was running at triple speed. Inside, Seraphina crossed the threshold. The facility smelled like rust and standing water and industrial cold. The loading bay had been cleared of its original equipment, replaced by the portable infrastructure of a temporary operation. Generators, communication arrays, folding tables covered in laptops, and monitoring equipment. 6 men occupied the space, each positioned with the deliberate spacing of professionals covering angles. At the far end of the bay, beneath the work light, Elena Moretti sat in the chair exactly as she'd appeared in the video, upright, bound, watching the door with the steady composure of a woman who was terrified and absolutely refusing to show it. And Victor Draven stood in the center of the space, his hands clasped behind his back, watching Seraphina walk toward him with an expression of complete satisfied control. "There she is," he said. His voice was the same, exactly the same. That smooth, modulated warmth that functioned as a warning the way weather functions as a warning. Its pleasantness, the specific indication that something terrible was building behind it. Seraphina stopped 12 feet from him. Her hands were visible. The 9mm was holstered openly at her hip. The SIG was invisible against her back. "Victor," she said, "you look well. Better than I expected, given recent events." He tilted his head slightly. The studying posture, the entomologist examining something pinned. "Did he hurt you?" "No." "Pity. I was hoping the Moretti temper would do my work for me." He smiled, teeth like a dentist's waiting room. "But you found a way to make yourself useful instead. That's always been your gift, Seraphina. Survival by utility. I trained that into you very early, and you absorbed it beautifully." "Let her go," Seraphina said, nodding toward Elena. "She's not part of this. She's whatever I need her to be. Currently, she's an invitation. You accepted it, which means she's served her purpose, more or less." He paused, studying Seraphina's face with the precision of a man reading a document he helped write. "You came alone." "Yes." "No, you didn't." The temperature in the room changed. "Your husband is 3 minutes behind you," Draven said. "Probably at the southeast corner by now, looking for the ventilation intake that every building of this type has at ground level. I know because I know you. I know everything you memorized about my operational patterns, and I know you'd use every piece of it the moment you had someone capable enough to act on it." He took a step toward her. "I built you, Seraphina. I know exactly how you think. I always have." Behind her, she heard the facility's rear entrance, the sound of a door that should have been unguarded being opened from the outside. But the sound that followed wasn't Cassian moving through. It was the click of weapons being raised. "He's inside," a voice said in Russian. "Both of them." Seraphina's breath stopped. She turned. Cassian was standing in the rear entrance with Marco beside him, and 4 of Draven's men behind them with weapons pressed to the base of their skulls. Marco's face was a mask of controlled fury. Cassian's face was nothing at all. The blankness of a man who's walked into a room and instantly recalculated every variable and found nothing that works. Draven's voice came from behind her, still smooth, still unhurried. "The ventilation intake has been sealed since yesterday morning. I had it welded shut when I chose this location. Because I chose this location knowing you would tell him exactly what you'd tell him." He moved into Seraphina's peripheral vision, his hands still clasped behind his back, his posture the obscene ease of a man who's never lost. "I didn't send 14 men to your estate to breach it, Seraphina. I sent them to lose, in exactly the way you'd predict, so that you would feel useful, so that he would trust you, so that when I offered you the bait of this facility, you would bring him here willingly." The room seemed to contract. Every detail she'd offered, every tactical calculation, every pattern she'd claimed to know, used, not by Cassian against Draven, by Draven against Cassian. "The bug in the basement was placed 2 weeks ago," Draven continued, stopping beside her now, close enough that she could smell his cologne, cedar and something chemical underneath, like a clean room. "I've heard every conversation in that house since before the wedding. I didn't need you to tell me what you knew. I needed to hear you tell him, because the only way to get Cassian Moretti to walk into an open-ground killing field in the middle of the night is to convince him it was his plan." Seraphina's hands were shaking, not from fear, from something worse, the specific, annihilating feeling of being the instrument of destruction aimed at the only person who'd looked at her as something other than a problem to be managed. Across the room, Cassian looked at her. His eyes moved from her face to Draven's proximity to her, back to her face. And in the fraction of a second before his expression sealed over into operational blankness, she saw it. Not accusation, not betrayal, something far worse. Understanding. He understood she hadn't known, and he understood that it didn't matter. "Sit down," Draven said to Cassian, gesturing to the second chair that had been set beside Elena's. "Both of you." His men pushed Cassian and Marco forward. Cassian walked without resistance, his body absorbing the handling with a stillness that was more frightening than struggle, and when he passed within 6 feet of Seraphina, Their eyes met for one suspended second. He didn't look away. Neither did she. In that look was everything. The 24 hours that had compressed a lifetime of damage and walls and slow, impossible renegotiation into something that had no word for it yet, but was already too large to survive losing. Draven's man shoved Cassian into the chair beside his mother. Elena Moretti reached sideways with her bound hands and found her son's arm. Her fingers closed around his wrist. He let them. "Now," Draven said, moving to stand in front of them, "let me explain what's going to happen. Cassian, you're going to transfer the operational control of every Moretti shipping and logistics contract in the Northeast to a holding company I'll provide the details for. You're going to do this from your phone tonight, with Marco watching to make sure the accounts are legitimate. In exchange, you and your mother will leave this building alive." "And her?" Cassian said. His voice was flat, factual. Draven looked at Seraphina. The smile returned. "She comes home," he said simply. The word dropped into the room like something dead. Cassian's jaw tightened. A single tendon flexed in his neck. His hand, resting on his knee, curled into a fist so slowly it was almost imperceptible. "No," he said. Draven raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? I said no." Cassian's eyes moved from Draven to Seraphina. Something in them had shifted. Not the operational blankness, not the performative coldness he'd worn since the wedding. Something that had been building quietly for 24 hours and had apparently reached the point where the container couldn't hold it. "You're not taking her anywhere." "Cassian," Marco said carefully from his position against the wall. "This isn't... She's my wife." The words were quiet and absolutely final, with the specific weight of a decision being made in real time, out loud, by a man who'd spent his entire adult life making decisions in private. "She came here to protect me. She used everything she had, and it wasn't enough, and that's not on her. Nobody takes her." Draven studied him with the mild interest of a man watching an animal behave unexpectedly. "You married her to destroy her," Draven said. 2 days ago you told your consigliere she was a debt to be collected. Now you're... what? Protecting her? Out of sentiment?" The mild interest sharpened into something colder. "She's made you irrational, Cassian. That's what she does. I designed her to do it." The word landed in Seraphina's chest like a blade. Designed. She'd known it intellectually, known that Draven had arranged everything, the wedding, the timing, her placement in Cassian's life. But hearing it stated aloud in front of the man who'd spent the last 24 hours becoming the first person in years she'd trusted was a different order of injury entirely. She looked at Cassian. He was already looking at her. "It doesn't change anything," he said, and she understood that he wasn't speaking to Draven. Draven's patience, never expansive, ran out in that moment. He nodded to the man standing behind Elena. The man produced a knife. Elena Moretti made no sound. She lifted her chin and stared at the opposite wall with an expression so deliberately composed that it broke Seraphina's heart in a way she hadn't expected. The specific heartbreak of watching someone be brave for an audience that doesn't deserve it. "The transfer," Draven said to Cassian. "Your phone, now. Or I will demonstrate to you in very specific terms why sentiment is a liability in our world." Cassian's hand moved toward his jacket pocket. Seraphina moved her hand toward her lower back. The Sig Sauer was still there, invisible, undetected. Because Draven's men had searched Cassian and Marco at the rear entrance. They hadn't searched her. Because she'd walked in through the front door. Because she was the prize. And Draven, who claimed to have built her, who claimed to know exactly how she thought, who had spent years cataloging every pattern she possessed, had made one single, catastrophic... She pulled the Sig in one motion. No hesitation, no warning. The safety was already off because she'd clicked it off in the SUV 400 meters away when she decided exactly how this was going to go. And the barrel was level with Victor Draven's shoulder before anyone in the room had processed that her hand had moved. She shot him. The crack of the unsuppressed weapon inside the metal building was enormous. A physical concussion that bounced off corrugated walls and slammed back into the chest like a fist. Draven spun left and went down to one knee, his right shoulder erupting backward, his perfectly pressed charcoal jacket tearing open in a ragged red flower just below the collarbone. He didn't scream. She'd expected him to scream. He didn't. He hit the concrete on one knee and one hand and made a sound that was more surprise than pain. The sound of a man encountering an outcome he'd removed from his calculations. The room exploded. Cassian came out of the chair before Draven hit the ground. He'd been waiting, she understood that now, reading it backward. He'd been tracking the micro-movement of her shoulders since she'd shifted her weight. And the moment the shot broke, he was already moving, left hand grabbing the wrist of the man behind him who'd been raising a weapon toward Draven's voice, right elbow driving back into the man's nose with a crack that dropped him sideways like a sack of wet concrete. Marco went low. He hit the floor and rolled left, taking the legs out from under the nearest guard. And by the time that man was falling, Marco had the man's weapon stripped from his hand and was coming back up with it leveled. 3 seconds. In 3 seconds, the room had gone from Draven's total control to something else entirely. Not chaos, not yet, but the tipping point between control and chaos, that razor-thin instant where everything is still possible in both directions. Then Draven's remaining men recovered. The first shot came from the far left, high, panicked, punching through a laptop screen and spraying plastic fragments across the equipment table. Seraphina moved right, ducking below the line of the folding tables, and returned fire twice, suppressing, not aimed, buying the fractional seconds she needed to get behind the concrete support pillar at the room's center. She heard Cassian hit someone very hard, heard the specific sound of a body meeting a concrete floor with the kind of force that doesn't come from falling. "Elena," Cassian's voice, sharp and commanding, cutting through the noise. "I'm here." Elena Moretti's voice was steady, impossibly steady. "I'm fine, go." Seraphina pressed her back against the pillar and looked across the room. She could see Draven from here, still on one knee, his right arm hanging useless, his left hand pressed against the wound with a pressure that was doing nothing for the blood spreading across his shirt in a dark, widening stain. His face was turned toward her with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not anger, not calculation, pain. Raw, physical, human pain. The expression of a man who'd built an empire on the suffering of others and had just discovered he was made of the same destructible material as everyone else. She wanted to cross the room and put the second shot through his skull right then. She didn't. Because 2 of his guards were still active, one taking cover behind the communication array to her right, one circling along the left wall toward Cassian's position. And if she moved from the pillar, she gave both of them a clean line. "Cassian," she called. "Left side," he called back. He'd seen it too. "Right side is mine." A beat, then 3 seconds. She counted in her head. 1. She shifted her grip on the SIG, both hands, elbows in. 2. She pulled a breath and held it. 3. She stepped out from the pillar and moved right in a low, fast diagonal toward the communication array, while her peripheral vision registered Cassian exploding from behind the equipment table in the opposite direction. The guard on the right brought his weapon up. Seraphina was already inside his arm. She'd learned this in the facility, not from Draven's men training her, but from watching them train. 712 days of watching how these men moved, how they held their weapons, where they looked when they were afraid. She knew that a man with a shoulder-holstered weapon tracks the muzzle with his eyes before he tracks the target. A half-second tell. Enough. She got a hand on the weapon, drove it up and wide, and the shot that came out of it went into the ceiling and punched a hole in the corrugated roof that let in a thin line of rain. Her second hand came up with the SIG, and she drove the barrel into the man's solar plexus. Not a shot, a strike, a pistol whip to the soft tissue below the sternum that folded him in half. Then she hit him in the back of the head with the butt of the weapon, and he went down. To her left, Cassian had finished. She didn't see exactly what he'd done. She saw the aftermath. A man crumpled against the wall in a position that suggested multiple broken things, and Cassian standing over him with blood on his left hand and a breathing pattern that told her he'd taken at least one hit somewhere she couldn't see yet. Marco was across the room covering the door, his borrowed weapon pointed at the entry, waiting for the outside guards who should have been responding to the gunfire. They hadn't come yet, which meant either they were staged and waiting for instruction, or they'd been dealt with by the men Enzo had in position outside. Enzo. Cassian had called him. She remembered that now. During the drive, while she'd been running tactical calculations in the back seat, she'd heard Cassian speak briefly into his phone in Italian, and she hadn't caught all of it. But she understood now. He'd brought a net, a wide net. While she walked through the front door and he went for the window, Enzo had been closing the perimeter. He hadn't told her because if Draven was listening, and Draven had been listening, always listening, he would have had more men staged. But Enzo's team was unknown to Draven's surveillance because they hadn't been present at the estate. Smart. Cassian was smart in the specific, infuriating way of men who don't explain themselves. She crossed the room to Draven. He was still on his knees. His left hand had given up on the wound and dropped to the floor, and he was breathing in long, effortful draws that rattled slightly. Bad sign, she knew, the sound of air mixing with things it shouldn't mix with. The shoulder shot had gone deep, maybe hit something beyond the muscle. He was losing blood with a speed that gave them a window that was narrowing by the minute. She crouched in front of him. His eyes found her face. That calculation came back, diminished, swimming slightly with pain and blood loss, but still running, still looking for the angle. "Seraphina," he said. His voice was still smooth, still modulated. It cost him visibly. "You've just ended any chance you had of walking away from this. Every contact I have, every name in my network, the moment I'm dead, tell me about the trafficking routes," she said. "The ones running through Baltimore and Newark, the names of the officials on your payroll, the accounts." "That's not how this works." "How it works is that you're bleeding into your lung cavity and you have maybe 20 minutes before that becomes an unrecoverable situation. How it works is that I spent 2 years in a room with no windows learning that pain is just information, and right now you're receiving a great deal of information. How it works is that I'm the only person here who knows enough about your operation to understand the difference between a truth and a lie." She held his gaze. Her voice was completely flat. "So start talking." Something moved across his face. Not respect. She didn't want his respect. Would have set it on fire if he offered it. Something closer to the thing that happens when a predator finally encounters something it can't read. "You know what the worst part is?" he said. "I genuinely thought you were my best work." "I'm not your work," she said. "I'm what survived your work." She stood and looked at Cassian, who had materialized behind her at some point. Close, a foot away, his presence registering in the particular way it had begun to register over the past 24 hours, like a change in air pressure. "He needs to stay alive long enough to talk," she said. "I know. Is Enzo outside?" "He's clearing the perimeter. 2 guards outside, both down non-lethally. He'll be inside in 4 minutes. Your mother? Marco's with her." She turned to look at Elena Moretti, still in the chair, watching everything with those steady, dark eyes that were Cassian's eyes in an older face. Marco was crouched beside her, cutting the zip ties with a folding knife, speaking quietly in Italian. Elena nodded at something he said, and then looked across the room at Seraphina. Their eyes met. Elena said nothing, but something in her expression shifted, a fractional softening around the corners that a stranger would have missed entirely, but that Seraphina, who had spent years reading every micro-expression of every dangerous person in her proximity as a survival function, caught with absolute clarity. She looked away before it could mean anything. Draven laughed. It was a wet sound that cost him. He pressed his hand back against the wound and breathed through it, and when it passed, he looked up at both of them with an expression that was wrong, too composed, too contained for a man bleeding on a warehouse floor. "You think this is over," he said. "You're both standing here thinking you've done something, but you haven't done anything. I've built 20 years of infrastructure, accounts you'll never find, people you'll never identify, operations running on automated protocols that continue whether I'm alive or not." He paused, breathed. "You can kill me. It changes nothing. Everything I built continues without me." "Name one account," Cassian said. "One account, one contact, one route. Prove you have something worth negotiating with." Draven smiled. Bloody at the teeth now. "Negotiating? You think I'm negotiating?" He looked at Seraphina. "He doesn't understand yet. Tell him." "Tell him what?" "That the real leverage isn't here. It's not the accounts, not the routes. I could give you every name in my network and it would cost me nothing in the long run, because the real operation, the one that actually matters, isn't about the Morettis at all." His eyes were starting to film slightly, pain and blood loss pulling at his focus. But underneath the deterioration, something sharp remained. Your brother Cassian, Nico. Cassian went very still. The man who pulled the trigger in the warehouse. You've always assumed it was one of the Benedetti crew. I let you assume that because a misdirected grudge is extraordinarily useful. It keeps powerful men focused in the wrong direction. Draven coughed, caught it, continued. It wasn't the Benedettis. It was a man named Garrett Hale, former military contractor, currently residing in a brownstone in Carroll Gardens under a name you won't recognize. And Garrett Hale works for... A pause. The drawn-out sadist pleasure of a man delivering the last weapon in his arsenal. A man who currently sits on the Moretti family council. But the room held its breath. You have a traitor above Marco, Draven said. Someone who's been feeding me intelligence from inside your organization for 4 years. Someone who approved of everything I've done because they wanted the Moretti empire divided and weakened for their own succession plans. His eyes moved to Cassian's face, reading the impact, eating it. Killing me doesn't find that man, and without finding him, everything you've built in the last 48 hours falls apart within a month. Cassian didn't move, didn't speak. His body was doing the thing it did when he was processing information that required complete stillness, a carved quality, like something waiting to be struck. Seraphina watched him. Her heart was slamming in her ribs, but her breathing was controlled. She controlled her breathing with the desperation of someone who'd learned that it was the one thing that could always be controlled. Name, Cassian said. Transfer the accounts, Draven said. Then I'll name him. You're not in a position to negotiate. I'm dying on a warehouse floor. I have nothing left to lose. Give me the transfer and I'll give you the name and your organization survives. Don't give it to me and I bleed out in 20 minutes, and you spend the next year looking over your shoulder while someone inside your council dismantles everything your family built brick by brick. Silence. Cassian looked at Marco. Marco gave a barely perceptible shake of his head, the rapid, almost invisible calculation of a man running through 12 variables and not liking any of the answers. Then Cassian looked at Seraphina. She understood what he was asking, not for tactical advice. He was asking whether Draven was telling the truth. He was asking her to read the man who'd built her and broken her and claimed to know her inside out, asking her to use what he'd done to her as a tool against him one last time. She looked at Draven's face, at his eyes, which were going glassy at the edges but still burning at the center with that specific quality she'd learned to identify in the facility. Not desperation, not performance. Truth. The last leverage of a man with no other currency. He's not lying, she said quietly. Cassian's jaw worked. His hand found the phone in his jacket pocket. Marco, he said, set up a dummy transfer account. Something that'll look legitimate for 30 seconds but route back to a frozen asset the moment he verifies. Can you do that? Marco was already moving. Give me 4 minutes. You have 2. Marco moved. Cassian crouched down to Draven's level, dropping into the specific crouch of a man who intends to be at eye level, not because he's offering respect, but because he wants to see every flicker in real time. While we wait, Cassian said, the facility, the other survivors. How many people are still being held in Draven Industrial Properties? Draven's eyes were getting heavier. He was fighting it. Why do you care? Because someone I care about spent 712 days in one of your facilities, and I want to know who else is still counting. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Something in Draven's face, not guilt, he wasn't built for guilt, but the slight recalibration of a man encountering a motive he hadn't modeled. Whitmore, he said finally. 6 current residents, not voluntary. There are 2 other properties, one in Virginia, one in Quebec. Similar situations. Total occupancy. He paused, breathed, the rattling quality more pronounced now. Somewhere between 20 and 30. Seraphina's eyes closed for 1 second. 1 second exactly. Then they opened again. 20 to 30 people. Somewhere between 20 and 30 people currently in the dark, counting days, learning the rhythm of their captor's footstep. She put it away. Sealed it. Later. It would be dealt with later, and it would be dealt with completely. And every single name on that list would see the outside of those buildings. But she couldn't carry it right now because right now she needed both hands. Marco looked up from his phone. Account set. 30-second verification window before the freeze kicks in. Maybe 45 if he doesn't look too closely. Cassian held his phone in front of Draven. Transfer confirmation is there, standard format, verify it. Draven looked at the screen. His eyes moved across it with a thoroughness that even blood loss couldn't diminish. He was looking for the trick. She watched him look. He didn't find it. Because Marco was very, very good. Aurelio Senna, Draven said. The name landed in the room like a physical object. Marco made a sound, involuntary, barely audible, like someone had pressed a thumb into a bruise. Cassian's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. A single, deep fracture that opened and closed so fast it was almost impossible to catch. Aurelio Senna, 63 years old, 38 years in the Moretti organization, head of the family's legitimate real estate and construction holdings. Cassian's father's oldest friend, the man who had held Cassian at the funeral when his father died, the man who had recommended 3 of Cassian's current senior staff, the man who had been present at every significant organizational meeting for the past 4 years. He approached me 12 years ago, Draven said, and his voice was fading now, the effort of sustaining coherence becoming visible. Wanted the Moretti empire restructured with himself at the top, gave me access to family communications in exchange for operational support. The warehouse, Nico, all of it ran through intelligence Senna provided. He paused. His breathing was audible now. The rattling deepened. He doesn't know I'm here. He thinks I'm in London. When he hears what happened tonight, he'll move. Fast. Within 24 hours, he'll begin consolidating. You need to... He stopped. His left hand slipped against the floor. Draven, Seraphina said sharply. His eyes found her. Still sharp at the center. Still that specific burning quality. You were my best work, he said again. Softer this time. Without the performance. Just the actual thought behind it, which was somehow worse. I wasn't your work, she said again. I was your mistake. His eyes closed. Cassian grabbed him by the collar. Stay awake. You don't die until I say. We need verification on Senna. What do you have? Documents? Recordings? What proof do you have? Draven's eyes opened a fraction. Server. Encrypted. The access key is a sound from outside. Not Enzo's team. Something heavier. The specific percussion of a large vehicle moving fast across the access road, headlights sweeping across the facility's high windows like a lighthouse beam. Then a voice through a megaphone, distorted by the metal walls but unmistakable in its authority. Federal agents. This building is surrounded. All persons inside will exit with hands visible through the main entrance. The room froze. Marco turned toward the door. Cassian's grip on Draven loosened. Seraphina stood with the cig in her hand and her mind running through the permutations at a speed that felt like burning. Federal agents. Here. Now. At 1:51 in the morning, in an industrial wasteland in the Meadowlands, within an hour of Cassian's assault on the estate and 20 minutes of their arrival at this facility. That's not a coincidence, she said. No, Cassian agreed. His voice had gone flat in a new way. Not the operational blankness, not the controlled fury. Something colder than both. That's Senna. Marco looked at him. Senna called the FBI on us? Senna's been feeding them intelligence for 4 years. Draven just told us. He gives them just enough to keep them watching us, never enough to make an actual case. Keeps us distracted, keeps us exposed, makes sure the Morettis are always one step from indictment. Cassian stood from his crouch. Tonight he sent them here. Because Senna thinks Draven is in London, but he knows I left the estate in a hurry. And when he finds out where I went, he'll let the FBI do his cleanup for him, Seraphina said, and walk into the power vacuum tomorrow morning. Outside, the megaphone again. Closer. 2 vehicles now, light slicing through the roof gaps, throwing long shadows across the concrete floor. Cassian looked at Marco. Marco looked at Draven, who was conscious but barely, his breathing audible and wrong. We can't take him out the front, Seraphina said. If the FBI processes him, he disappears into protective custody, and everything he knows goes with him. Senna's lawyers will make sure he never talks. I know. The server he mentioned, the encrypted server with proof of Senna's involvement. Without it, Senna walks. And with Draven in federal custody, Senna will have whatever access codes he needs destroyed within hours. I know. Cassian turned to her. In the strobing light from the windows, his face was all angles and shadow and blood. There was more blood on him now, she noticed, a darkening at his left side where his shirt was sticking to his ribs. He'd taken a hit during the fight that he hadn't mentioned. Of course he hadn't. Where's the server? I don't know. Think. You memorized everything about his operation. I memorized his patterns and protocols and what I could observe directly. A private encrypted server could be anywhere. A property, a safety deposit box, She stopped. Something surfaced. A memory from the facility. Late, deep in the second year, when they'd moved her briefly to a different room for maintenance on her regular cell. She'd been in that room for 6 hours, and she'd spent every second of those 6 hours cataloging every detail with the frantic thoroughness of a woman who knew that information was the only currency she'd ever have. That room had equipment in it. Servers. Racks of black hardware she hadn't been able to identify at the time, but now, with 24 hours of context and Draven's operational architecture laid out in her mind like a map, she recognized what they'd been. The Whitmore facility, she said. Not the medical wing. The basement level below it. There was a server room. I saw it once. He wouldn't trust a private server to any location he didn't physically control. And Whitmore is the oldest property in his network, the original one. He'd keep it there. Cassian looked at her for 3 seconds. That's 4 hours away. Yes. Outside, the megaphone a third time. The main entrance doors vibrated with the percussion of someone trying the exterior handles. Cassian made a decision. She could see it happen. The specific quality of absolute resolution, everything else dropped. Marco. Get Draven stable, tie him off, pack the wound, whatever it takes to keep him breathing for the next 6 hours. Then get him out through the loading bay on the north side. Enzo's team can cover you. And if the FBI has the north side too, then improvise. He turned to Seraphina. You and me. We go for the server. That's 4 hours of driving and we've got... She looked at his side. How bad is that? It's fine. How bad? He looked at her. She looked back. A graze, he said. 2 ribs. Cracked maybe. Nothing structural. She moved to him before she'd decided to move. Her hands went to the hem of his shirt, pulling it up, and he let her. Standing completely still while she examined the wound with her fingers, the same clinical detachment she'd used to examine her own injuries for 2 years when no one else would. It was worse than a graze. The bullet had taken a channel along the lower left ribs, long, deep, bleeding steadily into the shirt but not spurting, which meant no major vessel. The ribs beneath were visibly discolored already, the bruising blooming fast in a pattern that said cracked or fractured. She pulled her own shirt off over the body armor, tore a strip from the hem, and wrapped it around his torso with a tight, precise pressure that she'd learned was better than nothing and worse than stitches. He watched her do it. When she finished and looked up, his face was 6 inches from hers. Neither of them spoke. The megaphone outside said something about final warnings. Can you drive? She asked. Yes. She pulled her torn shirt back over the armor, looked down at herself. Blood on her hands, blood on the shirt, body armor that didn't fit, hair escaping its tie and ropes around her face, a weapon in each hand. She looked like what she was. Someone who had decided to stop surviving and start fighting, and who understood now that there was no version of this that ended cleanly. Only versions where Victor Draven's machine kept running or versions where it didn't. She chose the version where it didn't. Then let's go, she said. They moved for the loading bay exit as the facility's main doors began to buckle inward, metal screaming against metal, the combined weight of federal authority pressing from the outside against a room that held the wreckage of 20 years of orchestrated violence. Enzo materialized from the dark in the loading bay like a man-shaped shadow. He took in Cassian's injury, the blood, the general condition of both of them, and compressed whatever he was thinking into 2 words. Cars are ready. Draven goes with Marco. Where's the north exit clear? 2 vehicles on the north side. But I've got 1 route. Service road behind the equipment yard. 30 seconds of exposure. Take it. Enzo nodded. He looked at Seraphina with the same skeptical hostility he'd worn in the estate basement, 6 hours and a lifetime ago. Then he looked at the way she was holding the two weapons. Loose, competent, neither defensive nor performative. Just the posture of someone who knew how to use them and had recently done so. He looked away. Nodded once. It wasn't acceptance, but it wasn't nothing. Cassian gripped Enzo's arm once. Senna is moving tonight. The moment you have Draven secured, get to the council members who are clean and lock down the family accounts. Nobody talks to Senna. Nobody takes his calls. Can you do that without alerting him? If I move in the next 2 hours. After that, Enzo shook his head. Move now. They split. Marco taking Draven's barely conscious weight between two of Enzo's men. Enzo coordinating the north exit with the silent efficiency of long practice. And Cassian and Seraphina moving through the loading bay's far door into the cold open air of the Meadowlands, where the last of the rain was petering out and the eastern sky was beginning, barely, almost imperceptibly, to suggest the eventual possibility of dawn. The SUV was where they'd left it, 400 meters out in the dark. They reached it in under 2 minutes, running low across the flat ground while the facility behind them filled with the controlled chaos of federal entry. Seraphina got in the passenger side. Cassian got behind the wheel. The engine turned over clean and quiet. He pulled away from the facility without headlights, navigating by the ambient glow of the highway in the distance, until they were far enough from the perimeter to disappear into the grid of industrial access roads that connected this part of the Meadowlands to the world beyond. Then he turned on the headlights and accelerated onto the highway entrance ramp. North, toward Connecticut, toward Whitmore. Toward the server that held Aurelio Senna's name in every file, every transaction, every order. The 4 years of evidence that meant the difference between justice and another generation of the machine running quietly underground. Seraphina sat in the passenger seat and pressed her hand against her own ribs. Not injured, just the pressure of needing to feel something solid, and watched the highway open up in front of them, dark and wet and long. Senna was at the wedding, Cassian said. Not a question. He said it the way you say something you've been holding for several miles. I know. I remember his face. He stood in the front row. He hugged me before the ceremony. A pause, the highway light sliding across his face in rhythmic intervals. He told me Nico would have wanted to see me settled. Seraphina said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. Cassian's hand tightened on the wheel. The speedometer climbed. The dark rushed past. 4 hours, she said finally. Less, he said. I'll make it less. And somewhere behind them, in a federal processing facility in the Meadowlands, Victor Draven was being loaded onto a stretcher, alive, barely, still burning at the center of his eyes, with the specific intensity of a man who knew that the game wasn't over yet, that the server in Whitmore's basement was the pivot point on which everything turned, and that the two people racing toward it had no idea what was waiting for. They drove through the last of the night. Connecticut came at them in stages. First the industrial flatlands giving way to highway corridors lined with chain motels and truck stops. Then the highway narrowing into state routes that cut through sleeping towns where the traffic lights blinked yellow on empty intersections. By 3:30 a.m., the landscape had shifted again, the towns thinning out into stretches of dark woodland broken by the occasional farmhouse set back from the road with a single porch light burning against the black. Seraphina watched it all through the passenger window without speaking. She'd wrapped her arms across her chest. Not cold, just the habit of containment, the body folding inward during the spaces between crisis. Cassian drove with both hands on the wheel, his jaw set, the cracked ribs making themselves known in small, regular increments that he absorbed without comment every time the road shifted beneath the vehicle. He'd called Enzo twice. Both calls short, coded, confirmatory. Draven was in federal custody, alive, in surgery at a Newark trauma center. Marco had gotten him out through the service road before the perimeter closed completely. Enzo had locked down 3 of the family's primary accounts and reached 4 council members he trusted before Senna could move. Senna, as far as anyone could tell, was at his home in Westchester, unaware that the landscape beneath him had changed irrevocably in the last 2 hours. The clock was still running, just slower. "Tell me about Whitmore," Cassian said. It was the first time either of them had spoken in 40 minutes. His voice was lower than usual, roughened at the edges by pain and exhaustion and the specific quality of 3 a.m. honesty that darkness tends to produce. Seraphina took a breath. She'd been preparing for this question for the last 40 miles, assembling the architecture of the answer, deciding what to include and what to leave in the sealed room where she kept things that couldn't be carried in open hands. "The main building is 3 stories above ground," she said. "It looks like a country estate from the road. Fieldstone, old trees, a gravel drive. The kind of place that belongs in a real estate brochure. Draven bought it 11 years ago and spent 2 years converting the infrastructure before he used it for the first time." "What's the security layout?" "When I was there, 4 guards on the exterior perimeter, rotating in 2-hour shifts. The front entrance required biometric access, fingerprint, and retinal. Interior doors were key-coded. The basement levels were accessible only through an elevator that required a separate key card." "You won't have the key card." "No. But I know where the maintenance shaft is. Every building this old has one, a service access route that predates the modern security installation. Draven sealed the obvious ones. He didn't seal all of them because he didn't know about all of them. I found it in the 4th month. Cassian glanced at her. "You found an unsecured maintenance shaft and didn't use it to escape. I used it to listen." There was a ventilation junction 20 feet in that sat directly above Draven's private office, on the sub-basement level. I could hear everything he said for 3 weeks before they moved me to a different wing. She paused. "That's where I learned about Senna. I didn't know the name then. I knew a voice and certain specific phrases. But the voice matched what I heard tonight." The car was quiet for a moment. "You've been carrying Senna for 2 years, Cassian said. "I've been carrying a voice. Tonight it became a name. Another stretch of highway. The trees crowded close on either side, their canopies blocking the sky, creating a tunnel of dark that the headlights barely dented. Seraphina watched a road sign slide past. Litchfield County, 11 miles. "The residents Draven mentioned," she said. "The 20 to 30 people currently in his facilities. After tonight, after Whitmore, someone needs to go to the Virginia and Quebec properties. They'll be handled. I need to know that specifically. Not just handled, located, extracted, provided with actual support, not transferred to another institution that functions the same way. I need to know their names and their outcomes." Cassian looked at her again, longer this time. "I'll make sure of it personally," he said. She nodded, faced forward. That was enough. Not because she fully trusted it, but because she'd learned the difference between a performance of reassurance and a statement of intent, and what he'd just said carried the weight of the second. They reached the Whitmore Recovery Center at 4:47 a.m. The facility sat back from a narrow county road behind a wrought iron gate and an avenue of old oaks that had been there long before Draven bought the property and would be there long after. The gatehouse was dark. The perimeter lights were on their automated overnight cycle, low amber fixtures set into the ground along the drive, casting just enough light to make the darkness between them more complete. Cassian stopped the SUV half a mile back, off the road, in the concealment of a farm access track that ran along the property's east boundary. They sat for a moment. "How many residents currently?" he said. If Draven said 6. 6 in the main building, possibly more in the annex, a secondary structure behind the main building that they added in the last 18 months of my stay. I don't know its capacity. Guards, reduced overnight staff. Draven runs minimum overnight coverage because the facility's remote location and the sedation protocols eliminate the need for active supervision. 2 guards exterior, 2 interior, 1 medical staff member awake at any given time. Armed? The exterior guards, yes. Interior carries sidearms only. The medical staff is not armed. Cassian checked his weapon. She checked both of hers. The SIG at her back, the 9mm at her hip. "The maintenance shaft entrance is on the east boundary," she said, "near the old equipment shed. There's a concrete access panel in the ground. You'd walk past it 100 times without recognizing it. I'll find it." "We go together." She didn't argue. They moved through the tree line along the property's east boundary on foot, using the oaks for cover, their footsteps absorbed by the wet leaf litter that hadn't dried from the earlier rain. The sky was beginning to lose its pure black at the eastern edge. Not light yet, but the suggestion that light was remembering it existed. 4:55 a.m. The equipment shed materialized from the dark 30 yards ahead. A low stone structure, older than the main building, its wooden doors warped shut from years of moisture. Seraphina went left around it without hesitation, counting paces, and stopped at a point 11 feet from the shed's northeast corner. She crouched and pressed her palm against the ground. Leaves, wet soil, the cold bite of stone beneath. She cleared leaves with her hand. An 8-inch lip of concrete. She found the edge with her fingers, traced it. The access panel was 2 feet by 2 feet, flush with the ground, its handle rusted to the color of soil. It opened. The darkness below smelled like earth and metal and old pipe rust, a cold mineral smell that hit her in a way she hadn't prepared for, because this smell was specific, and her body knew it from 2 years of proximity, and her body was apparently going to register an opinion about returning to it, whether she wanted it to or not. She breathed, counted to 4, let the reaction move through her without letting it land. Then she dropped into the shaft. Cassian followed. The shaft was 40 feet of crawl space, pipes and conduit running alongside them, concrete walls slick with condensation, their progress measured in elbow placements and careful forward motion. Cassian's cracked ribs registered every change in position in specific, unambiguous language that he translated into silence. Seraphina moved ahead of him with the practiced efficiency of someone retracing a route her body still remembered. The ventilation junction appeared on schedule, a T-intersection in the shaft where the air current changed and the quality of sound shifted from muffled concrete to something that carried more broadly. She'd spent weeks in this junction in the 4th month. She'd learned the geography of the basement level by ear from this spot, cataloging footsteps and voices and the specific acoustic signatures of different rooms. She turned left at the junction, away from Draven's old office, empty now, presumably, or repurposed, toward the server room she'd seen during the maintenance period. 60 feet. The shaft ended at a ventilation cover that opened into a utility corridor. She listened at the cover for 30 seconds. Nothing. She unlatched it from the inside. The mechanism was the same as every other cover in the system, standardized during the renovation, unchanged in the years since, and eased it open. The utility corridor was exactly as she remembered it. Concrete fluorescent strips on timer, currently at their overnight setting. Half brightness, casting everything in a flat institutional white that seemed designed to remove the concept of time from the air. The server room was 12 feet left, behind a reinforced door with a keypad. She didn't have the keypad code. She had something better. She had the memory of standing outside this door for 6 hours, watching Draven's technical staff cycle in and out, watching the specific sequence of digits their fingers struck from the angle of the ventilation shaft above. Her fingers found the keypad. She entered the sequence. The lock released. Cassian exhaled behind her, a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite relief but contained elements of both. The server room was small, 8 feet by 10, its walls lined with rack-mounted hardware, the specific white noise of cooling fans filling the air. Half a dozen server units blinking in their methodical rhythms, storing what she could only begin to estimate in terms of evidence. She pulled the drive identifier from the nearest unit, cross-referenced the labeling format against what she'd heard Draven describe over the years, the specific nomenclature he used for archival versus active systems. Third rack, second unit from the top. A label in Draven's own handwriting, 3 letters and a number, the same format she'd heard him reference in the office below. She pulled the drive. It was smaller than she expected, the physical object. She'd carried the idea of it for hours, and its reality was a rectangle of black aluminum that fit in her palm, weighing almost nothing. All of it. Senna's name, 4 years of transactions, the orders that sent men to a warehouse in the Gowanus Canal, the intelligence that put Cassian's 23-year-old brother on a concrete floor in a burning building, contained in a thing she could close her hand around. She closed her hand around it. Cassian's hand covered hers. She looked up at him. In the server room's white noise quiet, with the drive between their palms and the distant hum of cooling fans, the only sound, she saw his face with a clarity that the previous 48 hours hadn't provided. The exhaustion was there, deep and structural, the kind that lives behind the eyes rather than in them. The wound at his ribs had bled through her improvised wrapping and darkened the left side of his shirt. There was a bruise forming along his jaw from the facility fight, and a cut above his left eye that had stopped bleeding and started crusting. He looked destroyed. He looked like a man who'd had everything he thought he knew dismantled in 48 hours and had kept moving anyway. She thought she probably looked similar. "We need to move," she said. "I know." Neither of them moved for 3 more seconds. Then a sound from the corridor outside. Footsteps. Not the even, purposeful stride of a guard on rotation. Irregular, shuffling. Someone moving in the careful way of a person who doesn't want to be heard. Cassian's weapon came up. Seraphina flattened against the wall beside the doorframe, the 9mm ready, her thumb on the safety. The footsteps stopped outside the door, a pause of 4 seconds that felt considerably longer. Then a voice, female, barely above a whisper, hoarse with sleep or something worse, came through the door from the corridor. "Is someone there?" Not a question, a statement. The specific tone of someone who has spent a long time hoping for something, and has learned to be very careful about letting that hope become audible. Seraphina looked at Cassian. He looked at her. She opened the door. The woman in the corridor was perhaps 30 or perhaps 40. It was impossible to judge because her face carried the specific age ambiguity of someone whose body had been through processes that redistribute the markers of time. Dark hair, unwashed, pulled behind her ears, an institutional gown that looked clean but smelled like the specific bleach and synthetic fabric smell that Seraphina knew from the inside of her own skin. She was thin in the way that isn't a body type, but a history. She looked at Seraphina with the same fractured hope she'd put into her voice through the door. Then her eyes moved to the weapon in Seraphina's hand. "I'm not going to hurt you," Seraphina said. She holstered the weapon. "Are you a resident here?" The woman's throat moved. "They call it that." "How many are awake? How many can move?" "3 of us that I know of. The others, the sedation protocol runs overnight. They won't be responsive until 6. Seraphina looked at Cassian. He was already calculating. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his eyes moved through the geometry of the corridor, the exits, the timing. "We can't take them all right now," he said quietly. Not callously, just the truth of it. "Not with 2 guards active inside and the perimeter watch. If we trigger an alarm before we're clear—" "I know," she said. And she did know. She knew, and it cost something she didn't have a word for, to know it and accept it and continue anyway. "We're coming back. Today. With people. Before noon." She turned to the woman. "What's your name?" "Diane." "Diane, I need you to go back to your room. Don't tell anyone we were here. In a few hours, people will come. Different people, not Draven's people. They'll get everyone out. Do you understand?" Diane looked at her for a long moment. The assessment of a woman who'd learned to evaluate promises by their texture rather than their content. "How do I know?" Diane said. Seraphina reached into her pocket and produced a card, one of Marco's business cards, which she'd palmed from the estate's entrance table 2 days ago, for reasons she hadn't consciously articulated at the time. She took a pen from the server room desk and wrote a number on the back. Cassian's personal line. "If nobody comes by noon," she said, "call that number and say my name, Seraphina. Can you remember that?" "Yes." "Then go back to your room." Diane looked at the card, closed her fingers around it, looked at Seraphina one final time with an expression that had no clean category. Hope, grief, the specific gratitude of someone who has been invisible for so long that being seen feels like a form of violence even when it's the opposite. Then she turned and walked back down the corridor, her shuffling steps receding until the next turn took her out of sight. Seraphina stood in the server room doorway for 4 seconds. Then she put the drive in her pocket and moved. They exited through the maintenance shaft, crossed the tree line, reached the SUV in 8 minutes. No alarm had sounded. No lights had come on. The facility sat in its amber perimeter glow, silent and apparently undisturbed, keeping its secrets for the last few hours they had left to it. Cassian sat in the driver's seat and didn't start the engine immediately. Seraphina sat beside him. The drive was in her pocket. The sky to the east had moved from the suggestion of light to an actual thin line of charcoal gray separating the tree canopy from the darkness above it. Dawn was maybe 40 minutes out. "We have it," he said. "Yes." Senna is done. If the drive holds what Draven described, we won't know until a technical team processes it. It'll hold what he described. He had nothing left to bargain with. He wasn't lying. She thought about Draven on the warehouse floor, his composure dissolving, layer by layer, into something almost human. She thought about what he'd said, "You were my best work," and the way he'd said it the second time, stripped of performance, just the actual thing behind it. The possessive pride of a man who'd built something extraordinary and could not comprehend that the extraordinary thing had turned against him precisely because of what he'd built into it. She thought about that for a long time after. The specific irony of it, the way survival, honed to its sharpest possible edge, eventually becomes something that cuts the hand that shaped it. "Start the car," she said. He started the car. They drove south through the spreading dawn in a silence that was different from the silences before it. Not tactical, not the quiet of two people managing proximity. Something that had settled, not peacefully. Nothing about any of this had arrived at peace, but with the specific quality of a storm that has fully passed, leaving behind wreckage that can finally be surveyed. At 6:12 a.m., Cassian called Enzo. "Send a team to Whitmore Recovery Center in Litchfield County. Full team, medical support, transport vehicles. 6 confirmed residents, possibly more. Get them out before noon and get them into legitimate medical care. Not a family facility, a real hospital with real doctors who are not on the payroll. I'll deal with the legal architecture afterward." He listened for 30 seconds. "I know it's complicated. Do it anyway." He hung up, drove another 10 miles. Then, without preamble, Aurelio Senna came to my father's hospital when he was dying. He sat by his bed for 3 days. He held his hand. A pause. The highway was waking up around them now. Early trucks, the first commuters, the city beginning its daily assertion that the night had never happened. My father trusted him more than almost anyone. Seraphina said nothing. She understood that some things require an audience rather than a response. "I trusted him," Cassian continued. "Not the way my father did. I don't trust the way my father did. But enough. Enough to include him in decisions that mattered. Enough that his voice in certain meetings carried weight it shouldn't have carried. He was careful about it," Seraphina said. "From what I heard, he never pushed, never advocated too strongly for any single direction. He just redirected. Subtly. The way water redirects through the path of least resistance. You don't notice it's been redirected until you look back at where you started. That's how he survived 4 years without anyone suspecting. Yes. Including me." The words sat on the air with their full weight. She didn't try to lift them off. "We all have the people we don't look at closely enough," she said finally. "The ones we've decided we know, so we stop checking. Draven counted on that. He counts on it everywhere. The entire infrastructure of what he built is constructed on the assumption that people stop looking at the things they've already categorized." Cassian's hand adjusted on the wheel. A small movement. A recalibration. "And us?" he said. The question was specific. She understood exactly what it was asking. "I don't know what we are," she said. 2 days ago, you married me to destroy me. Yesterday, you handed me a weapon. This morning, we drove 4 hours through a crime scene to steal evidence from a man who tortured me for 2 years. I don't have a category for that. Neither do I. Then maybe we don't need one yet." He looked at her. Brief. "Just a second," Highway demanded, his eyes back immediately. But in that second, she saw something she'd seen only in fragments before, always sealed over before it could become legible. Something that had been building beneath the controlled surface of him since the moment he'd found the scars on their wedding night and stood speechless in the lamplight of the master suite. Something that looked in its raw form like the specific terror of a man who has learned to build walls and has just realized the walls are porous. She knew the feeling. She'd lived in it for years. "Drive," she said quietly. He drove. They reached the estate at 7:44 a.m. It looked the same from the outside. Iron gates, stone walls, the old oaks beginning to catch the morning light in their upper branches. But inside was where the previous night's violence had rearranged the furniture of the ordinary. Marco met them at the service entrance. He looked like a man who'd been awake for 26 hours and had metabolized every one of them through caffeine and controlled fury. He took in Cassian's wound, the blood on both of them, The general condition of two people who had driven through the night after a gunfight and a covert extraction, and compressed his assessment into a single look that communicated both relief and exasperation with the economy of long familiarity. "Draven's in surgery," he said. "Stable. Federal custody. They don't know who he is yet. He had false identification when he was processed, and his biometrics aren't in any domestic database. We have maybe 48 hours before someone makes the connection." 48 hours is enough, Cassian said. He produced the drive from Seraphina's pocket. She'd handed it to him in the vehicle and held it out to Marco. "Get your best technical person on this. I need a verified copy of every file on this drive in my hands before Draven's identity surfaces. And I need Senna's transactions isolated and packaged for a federal contact I trust. Not someone in his pocket, someone clean." Marco took the drive, looked at it. "Aurelio Senna." Yes. Marco was quiet for a moment. He was 62 years old and had been Marco DeLuca of the Moretti organization since his 20s. In that time, he'd seen men he respected prove themselves to be other things. He'd been wrong about people before, but there was a particular quality to being wrong about Aurelio Senna that lived in the room with them now. Not just the organizational betrayal, but the human one. The specific cost of a friendship that had been a fiction. "I'll get it processed," Marco said. His voice was very controlled. "The council?" Cassian asked. "Locked down. 4 members confirmed clean. 2 I'm still uncertain about. Senna had time to build relationships, and I don't yet know how deep they run. Senna himself hasn't moved. He's at his house. Presumably, he doesn't yet know what happened at the Meadowlands last night. He will by noon. I know. We need to move on him before then." "Arrest or—" "Arrest," Cassian said. The word came out without pause, without the calculation that might have preceded it a day ago. Legal, formal, federal charges through the clean contact with the evidence on that drive. I'm not going to be Draven. I'm not going to make him disappear. I want him in a courtroom. Marco studied him. The slight change in emphasis, the specific way Cassian had said, "I'm not going to be Draven," registered as something more than a tactical decision. "Understood," Marco said. He looked at Seraphina, briefly, with an expression that had softened fractionally from the outright hostility of the previous night. "There's a doctor in the kitchen, for the ribs. Elena asked me to make sure you were both seen to before anything else happened." Seraphina looked past him toward the house. "Elena is here? She came back with Enzo's team 3 hours ago. She said she'd lived in this house for 40 years and she wasn't going to let a man in a warehouse tell her otherwise." A pause. "She also said she'd like to speak with you. When you're ready." Seraphina absorbed this without expression. Then she nodded once and went inside. The doctor was competent and mercifully quiet. He cleaned and stitched Cassian's side in 20 minutes, delivered a verdict of 2 cracked ribs and a recommendation for rest that everyone in the room understood was theoretical, and departed with the discreet efficiency of a man accustomed to providing medical services in circumstances he wasn't supposed to remember. Elena Moretti was waiting in the sitting room off the main hall. She was seated in a high-backed chair by the window, already dressed and composed despite everything. Dark wool, silver hair pinned back, the specific unassailable dignity of a woman who has made a philosophy of being composed. She held a cup of tea in both hands and watched Seraphina cross the room with eyes that were, unmistakably, her son's. Seraphina sat in the chair across from her. They studied each other for a moment. "I'm told you shot Victor Draven," Elena said. "Yes, and drove 4 hours through the night to retrieve evidence that will dismantle his operation." "Yes." "And that you walked into his facility voluntarily, knowing he intended to keep you." "Yes?" Elena set her teacup down with a precise, deliberate movement. "My son married you to hurt you," she said. "Not as an accusation, as a stated fact, the kind that requires acknowledgement before anything else can be built on top of it." "Yes," Seraphina said. "He told me 2 months ago when the arrangement was finalized that the Vale name owed the Moretti family a debt and that he intended to collect it in full." Elena's hands folded in her lap. "I told him that his father would not have recognized that logic. Domenico spent 30 years building this family's power, and he always said that power built on other people's suffering was a structure with no foundation. He He said it so many times that I stopped hearing it. She paused. I heard it again last night. Seraphina said nothing. She watched Elena's face with the careful attention she'd brought to every person who'd ever held power over her circumstances. I want to ask you something, Elena said, and I want you to understand that I'm asking it without any expectation of a particular answer. You've earned the right to whatever answer is true. Ask, do you want to be here? Not the circumstances, not the arrangement, not what it became in the last 48 hours. You. Do you want to be in this house? With this name? With everything that comes with it? The question landed in Seraphina's chest and sat there. She thought about the estate in Connecticut with its wrought iron gates and its amber perimeter lights, and its 20 to 30 people currently counting days in rooms without windows. She thought about Diane in the corridor, her hand closing around the card. She thought about the drive, sitting in Marco's hands, containing the architecture of everything that had been done to her, and to Cassian, and to Nico, and to her father, and to however many other people Draven and Senna had needed for their machine. She thought about Cassian in the server room, his hand covering hers over the drive. She thought about standing in the lamplight on the wedding night with her back to him, waiting for him to see the scars, and the specific sound his silence made when he did. I don't know what I want yet, she said. I've spent 2 years surviving what I was told to endure, and the last 48 hours surviving what I chose to fight. I haven't had enough time in between to locate the person who wants things. Elena looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across her face that was not pity. Seraphina would have closed down against pity immediately, and Elena seemed to understand this, but something more precise. The recognition of one person who has survived difficult things by one person who has also survived difficult things, filtered through the specific lens of a woman looking at the person her son might need to become someone other than what his grief had made him. That seems honest, Elena said. I try not to be anything else. Yes. Elena picked up her tea again. Drank. Set it down. He's going to need time too. Cassian. He's been running on the fuel of a story he told himself about who was responsible for Nico, and now that story is gone. What's left underneath it? She shook her head slightly. I don't know yet. Neither does he. That's the hardest kind of not knowing. When you've organized yourself around a grief, and then someone takes the grief's explanation away, you're left with just the grief. And the grief without a target is the worst version of it. I know, Seraphina said quietly. Elena looked at her. Understood. Of course you do, she said. And in those 4 words was an acknowledgement that functioned as something Seraphina hadn't received in years. Not sympathy, not pity, not the complicated discomfort that her history produced in most people. Just the simple recognition that she'd been carrying weight, and that the weight was real, and that the person across from her could see it clearly. Something in Seraphina's chest shifted. A small, almost geological movement, the kind you don't notice until the landscape it leaves behind is different from the one before. She didn't cry. She'd made a private accounting of her tears years ago and determined that she had a limited supply and she intended to spend them on things that deserved them. But she held Elena's gaze for a moment longer than she'd held anyone's in recent memory. Thank you, she said. It covered several things at once. Elena seemed to understand that too. Aurelio Senna was arrested at his Westchester home at 10:47 a.m. by federal agents operating on warrants obtained through the clean contact Cassian had used for years, a deputy director whose integrity had been tested repeatedly and had held. The warrants cited wire fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit murder, the last charge specific to the warehouse incident in the Gowanus Canal. Senna opened his front door in his bathrobe, a cup of coffee in his hand, and found 4 federal agents on his porch and a sealed van at his curb. He said nothing. His face, by the account of the agent who cuffed him, went through several distinct phases: surprise, calculation, something that might have been shame, and then finally the specific blankness of a man who has been caught and is now transitioning to the next phase of the game. He asked for his lawyer before the cuffs clicked shut. He got his lawyer. He sat in a federal holding facility in Manhattan and looked at a partial inventory of the drive's contents and said nothing for 3 hours. Then he said, I want a deal. He didn't get one. The drive contained 4 years of communications, transactions, and operational logs. It contained the order for the warehouse fire, attributed in Senna's own encoded language to an account that traced directly to him. It contained his arrangement with Draven, 12 years of it, the full history, the original approach, every piece of intelligence he'd provided, the specific payments disguised as real estate consultation fees that had funded the operation from the inside. It contained a recording of his voice, made by Draven's own surveillance of the very facility room where they'd met to finalize the arrangement, saying Cassian's brother's name in the context of what needed to happen to make the war begin. Senna's lawyer reviewed the materials and told his client that the deal he'd asked for was not going to be available. Cassian was told about this at 2 p.m. He was sitting in his study on the 3rd floor with his ribs strapped and a glass of water in front of him that he hadn't touched. He listened to Marco's summary without expression, and when Marco finished, he was quiet for a long time. Nico knew Senna, he said finally. He called him Uncle Aurelio. He'd known him since he was born. Marco said nothing. There wasn't anything to say. He held my father's hand when he was dying, Cassian continued. And the whole time he was feeding our communications to the man who'd already decided that Nico needed to die to start a war that Senna needed to happen so he could walk into the aftermath. He picked up the glass of water, put it back down without drinking. 40 years. He was in this family for 40 years. Yes, Marco said. Make sure the charges hold. I don't want plea negotiations. I don't want sentencing deals. I don't want him in a minimum security facility doing 5 years and walking out. I want the full weight of what he did to follow him for the rest of his life. I'll make sure of it. And Draven. Draven is out of surgery, stable. His identity was confirmed by federal authorities at 12:30. It took them longer than I expected because his documentation was extraordinary. He's now in federal custody under his real name, and the charges being assembled based on the drive contents are, Marco paused, searching for the right frame, significant. His legal team is already mobilizing, but the evidence volume is substantial, years of trials. He'll try to deal. He'll try. The federal contact says there's no appetite for it. Too much visible, too many agencies involved now that his name is confirmed. Draven in a courtroom is useful to too many people. Cassian nodded. He looked at the window. The city beyond it was moving through its afternoon in full indifference to everything that had happened in the last 36 hours. Its million private transactions proceeding without awareness that the infrastructure of one significant piece of their world's underside had been cracked open in the dark. The Whitmore residence, he said. Enzo's team extracted 6 individuals at 11 a.m., all transferred to Litchfield County Medical Center. The facility is currently under state police seal pending federal involvement. The Virginia and Quebec properties were flagged to the relevant authorities through the clean contact at 1 p.m. Extraction operations are being coordinated. Names and outcomes. I want them reported to me directly. I understand. Marco paused at the door. He turned back. Cass. Cassian looked up. You did the right things, Marco said. Starting from the moment you walked away from her last night instead of... He stopped. Started again. I've known you your whole life. I know what you were planning to do to her when you married her. And I know that most men in your position with your history and your grief would have done it thoroughly. A pause. I'm glad you didn't. Cassian said nothing. He looked at the window again. Marco left. The afternoon moved through itself. The organizational business of the Moretti family, briefly suspended in the shock of crisis, resumed in the particular form of aftermath management. Accounts being secured, council positions being evaluated, the careful excavation of 4 years of Senna's influence from the decision-making infrastructure of everything he'd touched. It was painstaking, and it would take months, and several things that had been built on compromised intelligence would need to be rebuilt from different foundations. Cassian oversaw all of it from the 3rd-floor study, working through the afternoon with the systematic precision of a man who understood that the most important phase of any war is the one that happens after the violence ends. At 5 p.m., he went looking for Seraphina. He found her in the library, the same room, the same high-backed chair by the window. But the posture was different than when he'd found her there the previous morning. She was sitting sideways in the chair, her legs over one arm, her back against the other, reading a book she was actually reading this time. He could tell by the quality of her focus, the way her eyes moved across the page with genuine absorption rather than the controlled blankness of someone performing stillness. She didn't look up when he entered. She finished the paragraph she was on first. Then she closed the book and looked at him. "How are your ribs?" she asked. "Functional." He crossed to the window and stood beside it, looking out at the grounds where Enzo's men were moving through the late afternoon light on routine patrol. The garden wall on the east side was still unrepaired, the broken motion sensors sitting dark and useless in their brackets. He'd get it fixed this week. He'd get a lot of things fixed this week. "How are you?" She considered the question with the same seriousness she brought to every question, not performing consideration, actually doing it. "I don't know yet," she said. "I keep waiting to feel something specific, relief or fear, or some defined emotional state that tells me what the last 48 hours were. I just feel very tired and very clear." Clear is good. It's different than good. It's just clear. Like after a long fever, everything seems very precise and slightly surprising that it exists. She looked at her hands in her lap. He's alive. Draven. He's in custody, but he's alive and he has lawyers and he has resources I don't know the full scope of. I told myself for 2 years that if I ever got out, I would find a way to end him completely, and he's not ended. "He will be," Cassian said. "Not quickly. But the federal machinery moves in one direction once it has evidence like what's on that drive. He won't see the outside of a federal facility again." "You sound certain. I've watched it happen to people I put in that machinery's path. It's slow and impersonal and comprehensive. Draven built his empire on speed and personal control. The thing that destroys him will be bureaucratic and indifferent, and he won't be able to find a human angle to work." He paused. "That's its own kind of justice." She thought about this. Her thumb moved along the spine of the closed book. "It's not the same as standing over him," she said. "No, it's not. But you chose it anyway. Charges instead of—" She tilted her head slightly. The other thing would have made me him," Cassian said. "Draven's entire method is deciding that someone deserves to disappear and making it happen outside of any framework except his own. I spent the last 2 days being furious that he'd done that to you, to your father, to Nico. I can't then do the same thing to him and call it different." Seraphina was quiet for a moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, something in her expression softened. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but the specific easing of someone who has spent a long time bracing for a blow that, this time, didn't come. "Your mother said you need time," she said. "My mother is usually right about these things. She said the grief without a target is the worst version." Cassian was quiet. The grounds below were golden in the late afternoon light, the east wall's shadow stretching long across the lawn, the old trees moving in a slow and indifferent wind. "Nico loved October," he said. "He said September was just October pretending. He'd have been annoyed that it rained last night. He hated driving in rain. Said the wipers always went at the wrong speed." He stopped, exhaled through his nose. "I've been talking to a dead version of him for 2 years, the version that died because of the veils. I don't know yet how to talk to the actual version, the real one, the one that died because Aurelio Senna decided power was worth a 23-year-old's life." "You don't have to know yet," Seraphina said. "Grief doesn't run on a schedule." "Says the woman who sealed hers in a vault and ran operations on it." "Yes, and notice that the vault cracked last night anyway. All sealing it did was preserve it at maximum pressure until something gave way." He turned from the window to look at her. She met his eyes without flinching, that amber-flecked steadiness that had been one of the first things he'd registered about her, the specific quality of someone who has learned to hold your gaze because they spent too long not being allowed to. "I'm not going to pretend the last 2 days cancel out what I intended when I married you," he said. "I know, and I'm not going to tell you what to do with that information. You've had enough people telling you what to do with your life." "Yes, but I want to ask you something, the same way my mother asked you something." She waited. "Stay," he said. "Not because the marriage is a legal fact, not because of what we know about each other now or what we did together in the last 48 hours. Those are real, but they're not a reason. Stay because this house is the first place in 3 years where nobody is trying to put you back in a room, because you have more intelligence and more capability and more survival in you than anyone I've ever met. And I don't think you should spend whatever comes next rebuilding from nothing alone when you don't have to." He stopped. looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. Stay, and let me try to be something other than what I was planning to be. The library held them both in its quiet. Outside, the afternoon continued its golden indifference. Somewhere in the house, someone was cooking. The smell of something savory drifting up from the kitchen floors below, an absurdly ordinary smell for the end of an extraordinary thing. Seraphina looked at him for a long time. She thought about what staying meant, the complexity of it, the ongoing proximity to an empire that ran on violence, the slow work of building something with a person who had wanted to destroy her and had chosen differently at a moment when he could have chosen the other way. The specific difficulty of trusting something new with hands that still remembered how the last thing they'd trusted had felt in the moment before it broke. She thought about what leaving meant. The world Draven had built was cracked, but not dismantled. She'd given the Moretti organization every piece of intelligence she had, which meant she'd burned every bridge back to obscurity. She had no money of her own, no documents under a name that wouldn't draw attention, no support network that hadn't been destroyed or compromised in the years of her captivity. Leaving was not freedom. It was a different kind of exposure, but those were the practical calculations, and she'd made a private decision sometime between the maintenance shaft and the drive back through the dawn that she was done making only practical calculations. I need a room of my own, she said, not the master suite, something with a window I can see the sky from without having to stand at an angle. There are 6 rooms on the east wing with full sky view. I need to be able to come and go from this house without asking permission or reporting my movements. Done. And the Whitmore residents, their outcomes, reported to me directly, not through Marco. Already agreed. And the Virginia and Quebec extractions. I'll add you to every update. She looked at him. He looked at her. The negotiation of 2 people who had both spent their lives in worlds where terms mattered, because terms were the only architecture that held when everything else gave way. Then yes, she said, I'll stay. The months that followed were not easy. Nothing about rebuilding is easy, and what Cassian and Seraphina were rebuilding was more than a marriage. It was 2 people who'd been structured by their respective histories into shapes that didn't naturally fit together, working against those shapes with the patient, sometimes brutal effort of people who'd decided that the alternative was worse. There were nights when the nightmares came back for Seraphina, the room without windows, the numbered days, the sound of the door. And Cassian learned not to touch her when she woke in the dark, learned instead to sit at the edge of the bed and speak in a low, even voice about ordinary things until the architecture of the present reasserted itself over the architecture of the past. He learned this by doing it wrong first and accepting the correction and doing it right after. There were mornings when Cassian sat in his father's chair in the study and looked at the framed photograph of Nico that had lived on the desk for 2 years, and the grief moved through him differently now, less like fuel and more like weather, arriving in passing, still painful but no longer organizing his entire internal landscape around itself. He understood this was Seraphina's work as much as his own, the specific influence of someone who had survived catastrophic loss without letting it become identity. The Moretti organization changed, not overnight, not without friction, but Cassian had always run his empire with precision rather than cruelty, and with Draven's machine dismantled and Senna's influence excavated from the infrastructure, the specific pressure that had been warping the organization's decisions for 4 years was gone. What remained was complicated and morally impure and would never be anything else, but it was his, and it was honest about what it was, which is a different kind of thing from what Draven had built. Seraphina became the mind behind certain of its transformations. Not the visible face, she had no interest in the visible face, but the intelligence behind decisions about information, about vulnerabilities, about the specific ways that organizations compromise themselves from the inside. She'd spent 2 years learning those patterns from the most accomplished practitioner of them she'd ever encountered, and she spent the next year using what she'd learned to build walls instead of tunnels. Victor Draven entered the federal court system in January and did not emerge from it. The trial was 18 months and produced a verdict that was comprehensive. His legal team was excellent, and it wasn't enough because the evidence was overwhelming and the number of agencies involved made witness suppression impractical. He was sentenced at 61 years old to terms that, assembled end to end, exceeded his remaining life expectancy by several decades. He said nothing in the courtroom when the verdict was read. His expression, observed by the reporters present, was described variously as composed, contemptuous, and stunned. None of these descriptions captured what Seraphina, watching the pool footage in the library, recognized in his face. She recognized it because she'd worn it herself, in a different context after a different kind of defeat. The specific look of someone realizing that the thing they built to protect them was the thing that undid them. She closed the laptop and sat with it for a while. Then she stood up and went to find Cassian. She found him on the terrace off the second floor, looking out at Manhattan's skyline in the late afternoon of a December day that had produced, improbably, 20 minutes of genuine golden light before the clouds closed back over it. The city glowed beneath the light in the specific way it glows when the sun hits the glass at the right angle, 1,000 windows catching fire simultaneously, the whole skyline briefly luminous. He heard her come out and moved slightly to the left on the terrace railing, making room. She stood beside him, their shoulders almost touching, the familiar distance of two people who had negotiated proximity over months into something that was neither performance nor avoidance. "The verdict," she said. "I heard." Below them, the city moved through its ordinary life in full ignorance of what had been decided in a federal courtroom on its behalf. Taxis, pedestrians, the complicated human metabolism of a city that has survived everything it's ever encountered, and will survive this too, without knowing it happened. "How does it feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Smaller than I expected. The thing I've been carrying for 3 years. I thought when it was over it would feel large. It feels precise, like setting something down. Is that good?" "I think so. I think large feelings are for things that are still happening. This is done." She looked at the skyline. "It's done, and I'm still here. That's something I didn't know how to imagine for a long time." He turned to look at her profile. She felt it without turning. "The scars," he said. She looked at him then. "I saw them the first night," he said, "and I've thought about them every day since. Not the way I thought about them that first night, which was, I was in a state that I'm not proud of. But every day since, I've thought about the specific fact that you carried all of that, every day for years, and still walked into every room like the room was going to have to adjust to you rather than the other way around." He paused. "I don't know what to call what I think about that. But it's not nothing. Seraphina was quiet for a moment. "Cassian," she said. "Yeah. I'm going to tell you something that I've been holding for a while because I couldn't determine whether saying it out loud would break it." He waited. "I was afraid of you on the wedding night," she said. "Not the way I was afraid of Draven's men. That's a particular kind of fear that lives in the body's emergency systems. It was different. I was afraid of you the way you're afraid of things you might want. Because I'd decided years ago that wanting things was the mechanism by which you got hurt, and standing in that room with you, I realized I was already making the calculation of whether this was a person I might want to matter to me." She held his gaze steadily. "And then I thought about what you'd told your men, about collecting the debt. And I put the calculation away." "And now?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "And now the debt is gone and Draven is in a federal facility, and your mother makes me tea and tells me things about your father that make him sound like someone I would have liked. And the 6 people from Whitmore are 6 people who are no longer in a room without windows. And I'm standing on this terrace watching the city and thinking," she stopped, breathed, "thinking that this is what safety feels like. That this specific moment, right now, is what I was trying to survive toward." He was looking at her with an expression that had no protective layer over it. Just the actual thing. Complicated and imperfect and real. The specific feeling of a man who has spent his adult life building walls and has found, to his complete surprise, that one of them has a door. He reached up and touched her face. Just his hand against her jaw, thumb at her cheekbone, the specific warmth of it in the December air. She let him. And then, slowly, with the deliberate quality of 2 people who understand that some things don't need to be rushed because they've already survived the worst of being not yet, she leaned into it. Below them, the city moved. The light was fading now, the brief gold retreating behind cloud cover, the skyline returning to its evening blue. Somewhere in it, thousands of separate lives were proceeding through their complications, their small defeats and small victories, the ordinary work of people trying to become something other than what their histories made them. The terrace held them in its quiet. Manhattan burned beneath them like something alive, and for the first time in her life. Not as a strategy, not as a survival calculation, not as the performance of a person who has learned to pass as unbroken, Seraphina Vale felt simply and completely that she was exactly where she had fought to be.